Catherine Caldwell signed her name across the divorce papers, set the pen down without a sound, and looked her husband in the eye. Dry, steady, not one tear. He had ordered her to sign. She had. No begging, no trembling, nothing he could use. Ethan waited for her to break the way the guilty always break. She didn't. And in that silence, a cold dread climbed into him that he had no name for. If you love stories of wronged women who rise, subscribe, and stay with me to the very end, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Sign it, Ethan Caldwell said. He set the document down on the oak table between them and stepped back the way a man steps back from a fire he means to let burn. Catherine Caldwell did not look at the paper. She looked at him. "You've written my name already," she said, "on the line above mine." "I have." "You were that certain I'd put mine beneath it." "I was." She let the quiet hold. She did not fill it. That alone was wrong, and he felt the wrongness before he could put words to it the way a man feels a step missing in the dark. He had braced for tears the whole ride home. He had rehearsed how he would not soften. He had told himself in the magistrate's voice he used from the bench that a weeping woman was still a guilty woman, and a man did no wrong to hold firm against tears. He had readied himself for weeping. He had not readied himself for this. For the folded hands, for the level chin, for the way she sat in the chair she'd argued him into buying and looked at him as though he were the one on trial. "Read it to me," she said. "You can read. I want to hear you say the words. I want to know whether you can." His jaw set. He took the paper up off the table, and she watched his thumb tremble once before it stilled. "Dissolution of marriage," he read, "on grounds of betrayal of the marital trust. The wife to surrender all claim upon the estate, the name and the holdings of the husband, and to remove herself from the household within the fortnight." He laid it down. "There, you've heard it. And the betrayal. Name it." "You know what you did." "No." Her voice did not rise. It never rose. That was the thing about Catherine that the whole county would learn before this was over, that the quieter she went, the more a wise man should have feared. "I'm asking you to say it. To my face. In your own house with the door shut and no soul to hear but the two of us. You're the magistrate Ethan. So judge me out loud. Charge me the way you'd charge any man before you ruined him." For a moment, he could not. That was the second thing wrong, and it landed harder than the first. He had sat across a table from cattle thieves and forgers, and men who'd beaten their wives until the women couldn't see, and he had named every charge to every face without his voice catching once. But his own wife sat there with her hands folded and asked him to name hers, and the words jammed up behind his teeth like stones in a creek. "There were letters," he said at last. "Letters. In your hand. To Mercer. There were nights I was on the bench in Richmond, and the household couldn't account for where you were. And there were sums." His voice found its feet at last, in the hard, familiar ground of figures and proof, the only ground he'd trusted these 2 years past. "Drawn against my estate. $300 in April, $200 in May. Drawn out of the office that holds 2 keys, mine and yours. And these letters, you read them. I held them in my hands. In whose company?" Ethan stopped. "In whose company did you hold them?" she said again, softer, which was worse. "Who carried them to you? Who stood at your shoulder while you read your own wife's ruin and made the little sounds a friend makes? Who filled your glass after and told you to be strong and said he wished to God he'd never had to bring it? It does not matter who. It is the only thing in this room that matters. You were alone with my accounts." He heard his voice climb and could not stop it. "You had the key, the means, the hand. A man does not need a confession when the proof is laid in front of him on the table." She was quiet a long moment. "I was alone with your silence," she said. 3 years of it. That's the only thing I was ever once left alone with in this house." And then she reached out and took up the pen. Something in him, some old, buried part he would spend the rest of his days trying to drown, rose up and wanted to put his hand over hers and stop her. wanted to snatch the paper off the table and feed it to the cold grate. He did not move. He told himself a guilty woman signs fast to be gone before the proof can be read aloud again. He told himself the calm in her was the calm of a thing already caught that knows the hunt is done. She dipped the pen. She did not hurry. She wrote out her name in the long, even hand he had loved before he'd taught himself to hate it, Catherine Hale Caldwell, and she set the pen down crossways over the inkwell so it would not roll the way she set every small thing in its right place, and she folded her hands again. No trembling, no tears, only ink. "There," she said. "It's done. You can stop being afraid I'll make a scene." "I am not afraid. You are terrified." She said it the way she might have remarked on the rain. "You've been terrified since I walked in here and didn't fall on my knees. You wanted me to beg. A woman who begs is a woman who's guilty, and a guilty woman lets a righteous man stay righteous. But I didn't beg, and now you're sitting there with your supper turning over in you, because if I'm not guilty..." She let the silence do the rest. "Then what is it you've just done?" Ethan stood because sitting had become more than he could bear. "You'll have the carriage in the morning," he said, "and a sum to settle you. I am not a cruel man." He heard her rise, heard the small whisper of her skirts and the door and her stop in it. "Ethan." He did not turn. "When you find out," Catherine said, "and you will, because the truth in a small town is a slow horse, but it always finds its way home. I want you to remember one thing. You had the chance to ask me, tonight, right here, and you chose to hold the paper instead of my hand. Remember that you wanted the proof more than you wanted me." The door closed, and Ethan Caldwell stood with his back to the room and felt the first cold finger of dread move down his spine. He had won. He had the signature lawful and his. So why under heaven did it sit in him exactly like a man who has lost? He did not sleep. He lay in a bed gone cold on the side that had been hers, and the house made the small night sounds a house makes, and none of them were her, and he found he could hear the absence of her, the way you hear a clock the moment it stops. 3 years he'd slept beside her breathing, and never once marked the sound of it. Now the want of it filled the whole black room. He made himself go back over it. He was good at that, going back over a thing, laying it out piece by piece. It was what had made him a magistrate at 34, when older men had wanted the seat. He had a mind that could hold a chain of facts and not flinch from where it led. So he held the chain. He had not always been a careful man. The town forgot that when they tipped their hats and lowered their voices near him. They forgot Ethan Caldwell had once been a boy who broke a colt by sleeping 9 nights in its stall, who had ridden to ask for Catherine Hale's hand with a fist of wildflowers crushed near to pulp because he'd gripped them the whole way over and couldn't make himself let go. He'd met her at her father's burying. Hale had died owing money and leaving a daughter with a sharp tongue and no fortune, and half the county had come to see whether she'd weep pretty. She had not wept at all. She'd stood at the open grave with her chin level and thanked every mourner by name. And when old Mrs. Pruitt said loud so it carried that it was a shame a girl so plain and so poor, Catherine had turned and said, "It's no shame to be poor, Mrs. Pruitt. The shame's in saying so over a man's open grave." And the whole row had gone dumb. He had ridden home that day, unable to get her out of his head, and he never had got her out of it since, not in 3 years of marriage, and not now in the ruin of it. He had courted her against his mother's wishes and his own accountant's arithmetic, married her in the spring. And for a while, he made himself say it into the dark, made himself look full at it for a while. She had been the only true thing in his life. She'd read to him of an evening. She'd kept his ledgers cleaner than his clerk ever had, and never once let him catch her noticing when his own figures slipped. She argued with him over everything, and yielded on nothing she believed, and bent on everything she didn't, and he had thought, fool that he was, that he understood her clean through. Then the appointment came. Magistrate. And with the appointment, Julian Mercer. Ethan turned onto his back and stared at the black where the ceiling was. Julian had come into the county 2 summers gone with a letter of introduction from a senator and a gift for making a man feel. His troubles were interesting. He'd sit in your parlor and listen to your grievances and turn them over slow, like a jeweler turning a stone, to find the one facet that took the light. And by the end of an evening, a man felt his small complaints were the stuff of consequence. It was Julian who had said it first, months back. "Light over cards. Catherine keeps your books, don't she?" Julian had said, and laid down a queen. "She does. Better than Foster ever managed." Julian had studied his own hand a while. "Bold of you. My uncle let his wife near the accounts, and woke one morning to find half his life signed off to a music master. But I'm sure Catherine's a different sort of woman." A smile. "She must be. She's so very—" And he'd hunted for the word, and found one that was neither a compliment nor an insult, and lodged like a splinter under the nail, self-possessed. Ethan had laughed it off that night. But the splinter stayed. Self-possessed. Was that not the very thing he'd loved at the graveside? And here was a clever friend, a friend with no reason on God's earth to lie naming it gently as a thing a careful husband ought to watch. That was how it had begun, not with a letter, not with proof. With one word over cards dropped by a man who smiled while he dropped it. Ethan pressed the heels of both hands hard against his eyes until the dark went red. He should have asked her tonight. She was right about that, and he hated that she was right, and the hate was the last thing holding down the rest of it. The cold rising notion here in the dark that he had been managed. Played the way he'd watched slick lawyers play a jury, fed one drop of poison at a time, each drop small enough to swallow until the whole of it was lodged too deep to spit back up. No. He stopped the thought cold. He had the letters. He had held them. He had known her hand. But the quieter voice, the one that had made him good before he stopped listening to it, asked a thing he could not answer. If the letters were truly hers, why had Julian Mercer been so almighty eager to put them in his hand? He turned the question over the rest of the night, and it would not lie still. And toward dawn it had grown a second question worse than the first, and Ethan Caldwell lay there in the gray, and was afraid of the morning for the first time since he was a boy. Catherine did not take the carriage. Mrs. Doyle found her in the kitchen at first light, dressed plain, braiding her own hair, because no maid would come to her now, and the old housekeeper stopped in the doorway with her hand pressed flat to her chest. "Ma'am." Her voice cracked on it. "In heaven's name, you're meant to be," he said the carriage at. "Good morning, Mrs. Doyle." "You're walkin'. He's turnin' you out to walk." "I'd rather walk." "It ain't right." The words burst out of the old woman before she could call them back. She had been 40 years in this house. She had laid out 3 Caldwell wives and raised 2 Caldwell sons, and never once in all that time spoken a word against the master. Catherine watched her war with herself and lose. "It ain't true what they're sayin'. I've kept your rooms 3 years, Mrs. Caldwell. I've seen your letters come and go, every one. There ain't a false thing in you. I'd swear it on the book before God and the magistrate both." "I know you would." Catherine tied off the braid. "Which is exactly why you mustn't." "Ma'am, if you swear it, they'll say you're a fond old servant lying for a kind mistress, and they'll turn you out the door behind me, and then there won't be one living soul left in this house who knew the truth of me." Catherine took the old woman's 2 hands in hers. "I need you to stay. I need you to keep your eyes wide and your mouth shut and your place by that stove. Can you do that? Even when it feels like betrayal, even when it shames you." Mrs. Doyle's eyes had filled and spilled over. "It'll feel like I left you to the wolves." "You're not leaving me to the wolves. You're staying behind the wolves' backs. There's a world of difference between the two, and one day it's going to matter more than you can guess." She let the hands go gently. "Now, before I walk out of here, tell me one true thing. The last week of May, the week before Mr. Caldwell rode to Richmond, who came to this house—" Mrs. Doyle wiped her face on her apron and made herself think. "The usual. Mr. Mercer twice. The Reverend the once. And Mrs. Grant." The housekeeper's brow drew down. "Mrs. Lillian Grant? Aye. She come to take tea while you were away at the Wilson farm. Sat in the front parlor near 2 hours waiting on you, she said, though you weren't expected, and you never came." The frown went deeper as the thing turned over in her after all these weeks. "Now there's a queer piece I'd clean forgot. She asked could she wait in the master's study on account of the parlor draft caught her chest. I left her there with the tea and went to see to my bread, and when I came back she'd gone home and the study door was pulled shut. That door's never shut. Catherine went very still. How long, she said, was she alone in that room? Half an hour. More, maybe. Mrs. Doyle searched her face. Ma'am, you've gone white as the cloth. What is it? What's it mean? It means I was a fool to take this for carelessness. Catherine drew one slow breath and steadied it. Mrs. Doyle, the accounts office off the study. There's 2 keys to it. The master's and the one I keep. Where is mine kept? In your sewing box, ma'am. Where it's always... The old woman stopped dead. Where it's always been. Catherine finished for her. In the parlor, open to anyone who sat there alone for half an hour with the tea and the draft in her chest and the door pulled shut behind her. The kitchen had gone so quiet the fire ticked in the grate. Lord above, Mrs. Doyle whispered. Mrs. Grant. Mrs. Grant hasn't the wit for it alone. She's the spite, but not the wit. Someone pointed her at that key. Someone told her where to find the letter's likeness to copy and what to write and how a forgery wants to be discovered, so a man can't help but believe it. Catherine lifted her single small bag off the table. Someone who needed a third hand inside this house, because his own hands had to come out of it clean. Mr. Mercer, said Mrs. Doyle. Catherine did not answer. She did not have to. Keep this between us, she said at the door. Every word. Forget you said his name to me if anyone asks. Especially if anyone asks. She paused. And Mrs. Doyle, that sewing box. Don't move it. Don't touch it. Leave my key exactly where it lies. If it ever comes to be looked at, I want it found precisely where a careless wife would have left it, and I want the dust round it undisturbed, so a clever man can see plain how easy it was got at. The old woman's wet eyes sharpened with sudden understanding. You're setting a thing, she breathed. I'm not setting anything, Catherine said. I'm just refusing to clean up after a man who counted on me cleaning up after him, same as I always did. He's used to me tidying the room behind everyone. Let's see how he does in a room I've left exactly as he made it. She walked out into the morning. She was halfway down the long drive on foot, her bag in her hand when she heard the horse. She heard it before she saw it, heard it pushed too hard. For so early an hour, heard the labored breath of it, and she stepped off the gravel into the grass and turned, and there was Julian Mercer reining up so close, the stones sprayed her hem. Mrs. Caldwell. He swept his hat off. He was a handsome man, and he knew to the penny the worth of it, knew just how the early light fell across his face, and he looked down at her with what any stranger would have sworn was grief. I came the moment I heard. The very moment. Lord Catherine on foot. He's turned you out on foot like a peddler. Good morning, Mr. Mercer. This is barbaric. This is beneath even let me take you up. Let me carry you into town to the Hartleys. They'll see you decent at least until... I'd sooner walk to town on a broke foot, Catherine said pleasantly, than ride 1 mile in your company. His smile held. That was the thing about Julian she had never once been able to make Ethan see. That the smile held, that nothing she could say would find purchase beneath it, because he had decided long ago what face to wear, and he wore it serene through anything. You're distressed, he said, gentle as a deacon. And no wonder. You've been wronged, terribly wronged, and I'll be the first man in this county to say it aloud. I told Ethan as much. I begged him. I said a man oughtn't act on a matter so grave without being dead certain. You begged him. On my honor. I pleaded for caution where you were concerned. Did you? Catherine looked up at him, and for the first time since the study, something moved in her face that was not calm. It was not anger either. It was a kind of terrible cold interest, the look of a woman who has just seen the whole shape of a thing, all at once, the way lightning shows you a field. You begged him to be careful. After you carried him the letters yourself. You are a marvel, Mr. Mercer. You truly are. You hand a man the rope, and then you weep at the foot of the gallows that he's gone and hanged his own wife with it. The smile flickered. Once. The width of a breath. but she caught it. "You want to be careful," Julian said, and the voice did not change, but something underneath it did. "What you go saying to folk now? A woman with no name left to protect her going about accusing her betters. That's a woman this town stops pitying real quick. Pity's a fragile thing, Catherine. It curdles." "Is that a threat?" "It's counsel." He set his hat back on. "From a friend." "Then let me return the kindness," Catherine said. "Free of charge, I've no name to charge under anymore." She stepped in close to the horse, close enough that he had to look down at her, close enough that the calm came back over her, like cool water poured, and she watched it trouble him worse than any weeping could have. "You made one mistake. Your kind always does. Clever men can't help it. You leave one thread showing one corner of the work uncovered because you can't bear that nobody will ever know how fine the thing was made. You leave it on purpose, half hoping someone will find it someday and marvel. You left yours. I don't yet know which thread it is, but I will. And when I take hold of it, Mr. Mercer, I am going to stand and pull, and I am going to watch the whole of your fine work come down on top of you in front of every soul whose hat you've ever tipped in this county." For a long moment, Julian Mercer said nothing at all. Then he laughed, a short, real startled laugh, jolted clean out of him, and it was the only honest sound he had made the whole exchange. "You know," he said half to himself, looking at her almost with wonder. "He never deserved you. I'll grant you that, and I'll mean it." He gathered the reins. "Good luck to you, Catherine. You'll want every grain of it. The town settled what you are 3 nights ago over their suppers, and there is not one thing on this earth a body hates worse than being told they were wrong about a tale they enjoyed telling." He turned the horse. "Mr. Mercer," she called after him. He paused. Why? It was the only question she could not reason her own way to, and she hated asking it of him, hated giving him the satisfaction of being asked. But she had to know. "I never did you a wrong. I never crossed you, never slighted you, never stood between you and a single thing you wanted. Why me?" And Julian Mercer looked back at her, and for one instant, the practiced grief and the easy charm fell clean away. And what lay underneath was nothing. She had a word for, not hate, not greed, something flatter and colder than either, something that frightened her more than anything he'd yet said. "Because he listened to you," Julian said. "Sat at that table and weighed your word over mine time and again on every matter that touched his office. And a man who listens to his wife is a man I cannot use." He touched his hat brim. "It was never about you at all, ma'am. That's the part that ought to keep you up nights. You weren't the prize and you weren't the enemy. You were just the door I had to take off its hinges to get into the room I wanted." He rode off, and the laboring of the horse faded down the river road, and Catherine Caldwell stood at the edge of the only home she had known for 3 years, and understood with a clarity that came near to peace, that she had never been the target at all. She had only been the cost. And a cost, she thought, watching the last of him go, is a thing a man stops counting once he's paid it. He'd already half forgot her. She could see it in the set of his back as he rode. To Julian Mercer, she was a closed account, a debt cleared, a door already off its hinges and lying in the yard. Which meant he would not be watching her. Which meant for the first time since this began, she had the one advantage that mattered most. She picked up her bag and walked on toward town. And she did not let herself cry, because she had work to do now, and tears were a thing she could spend later when they cost her nothing. By noon, the story had reached town ahead of her. She felt it before she saw it, the way the body feels weather coming in an old break. The first she met was Ada, the blacksmith's wife, who had stood up at Catherine's own table not 8 months gone, and sworn she'd never met a kinder soul, and who now discovered a powerful interest in the bolt of cloth in her arms, and crossed clear to the far side of the street to study it. "Good day, Ada," Catherine said anyhow. Ada's step hitched. She did not turn her head. "Mrs. she began, and could not settle on what to call a woman just unnamed, and so called her nothing, and hurried on with her cloth held up like a shield. The second was young Pruitt, same family whose grandmother had insulted Catherine over her father's open grave, and the grandson had the same wet, eager mouth on him. He did not cross the street. He planted himself square in the middle of the boardwalk, so she'd have to step down into the road to pass, and he looked her over. Slow, top to hem and back the way a man looks at a thing he's been told he's now allowed to look at. "Heard the magistrate finally come to his senses," Pruitt said. "Heard you been keepin' company you oughtn't, and dippin' your hand in the man's strongbox besides. That's so Miss Hale." He used her dead father's name like the flat of a hand across her face. "Reckon a pretty face'll buy a fool's good sense for a few years, but not forever. Not even out here where a body might have thought the standards lower." There were others on the boardwalk now, slowing. A small town's favorite theater is a fallen woman, and the seats were filling fast, and not one of them looked away. Catherine could have gone round him. She had told Mrs. Doyle silence was survival, and she had meant it. The wise thing, the safe thing was to drop her eyes and step down into the road and give them nothing to chew on over their suppers. She thought of Ethan holding the paper instead of her hand. She thought of Julian saying, "You were just the door." And something in Catherine Caldwell that had bent and bent and bent for 3 years and not yet broke, decided it would not bend on this boardwalk in front of these people. Not because it was wise, because she had run all the way out at last, and completely of any wish to be the thing they needed her to be. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, and her voice carried clear down the length of the boards, easy as a struck bell. "I'll answer you since you've troubled to ask in front of so fine a crowd. No, it is not so. Not one grain of it is so." She let her eyes travel the line of them, unhurried, naming none and missing not a one. "And here's a thing to chew on with your suppers, all of you. The man who first told you this tale told it because it served his own purse. The woman who carried it through your kitchens carried it because she has hated me since the morning I married better than ever she could. And every last soul standing here repeating it is repeating it because it makes a finer evening than the dull truth ever did." Back to Pruitt. "You'll go on telling it. I know that. I buried my father in front of this town. I learned that day what it loves and what it can't stomach. But I'll give you one thing I've come to know free, and you may do with it as you please." She stepped down off the boards and into the road to go around him, and she said it walking. "The truth out here is a slow horse. It won't run when you whip it, and it can't be bought, and it will not stay buried no matter how deep you put it. It just comes home, in its own time, to the same door it left from. And when it comes home to mine, I'd think long and hard, every one of you, on which side of this street you chose to stand, the morning it walked out." She walked on. Behind her the boardwalk had gone dead silent, and the silence trailed her the whole length of the street, and not one mouth among them, not even Pruitt's wet, eager one, found a single word to throw at her back. She did not let herself shake until she was past the last building and out on the empty road alone, and then she stopped and put her hand flat against a fence rail and let her knees do at last what she had not allowed them to do in the study, nor on the drive, nor on the boards before all those staring faces. She was alone now, truly alone in a way she had not been even at her father's grave. For then she'd still had a name, a future, and the child's faith that the world repaid the innocent in the end. She knew better now, but she knew one thing more, a thing Julian Mercer, for all his cleverness, had failed to reckon. He had taken her name. He had taken her home, her place, her station, her husband's faith in her. He had taken every single thing a woman in the year 1816 was reckoned to need to keep body and soul together. He had left her the one thing he should have feared the most. He had left her angry, and he had left her free. A woman with nothing left to lose. Catherine thought straightening up off the fence rail and wiping her face once with the back of her hand is the most dangerous thing God ever turned loose on a county. She had simply never been allowed to be one before. That same afternoon, Ethan Caldwell sat in his study with the letters spread before him on the oak and could not make them lie still in his hands. He had read them 100 times in the weeks before he signed. He had read them hunting for guilt and found it on every line the way a man finds his own face in every passing crowd once he's been told to go looking. Now he read them hunting for nothing in particular, emptied out, no verdict carried in ahead of the evidence, the way he used to read in the good years before Julian Mercer had taught him to read with his fear instead of his eyes. And the letters very slowly began to come apart in his hands. It was the ink first. He had held 1,000 documents to a window in his life, and he knew his own ink, the way he knew his own signature, knew the particular near black of the iron gall blend. His clerk mixed too strong, the way it bit into the paper and went brown-black at the very edges of every stroke within a season. The letters were written in it, his ink, from his office. He'd thought nothing of it before. Of course they were. She had the run of the house, didn't she? But he sat with it now and turned it the way Julian had taught him to turn a thing, and the wrongness of it rose up cold. A woman writing in secret to a lover does not stroll into her husband's locked accounts office, the one room she'd have to hide the most, to dip her pen. She'd use her own. She'd use the parlor inkwell, the kitchen pot, anything in God's creation, but the one ink in the whole county that points a straight finger back to this exact room, unless she never wrote them at all, unless they were written here in this room by a hand that had no ink to use but this room's. Ethan set the letter down very careful, like it had turned hot. Then the dates. The May letter, the worst of them, the one that had decided him, spoke of a meeting on the 14th. He'd been so sure reading it the first time, so righteous the 14th of May, him on the bench in Richmond, her whereabouts unaccounted by the household. But he kept books. He kept every book. He kept books the way other men kept faith, and his hand was already moving to the shelf before the thought was finished. He pulled the household ledger down and found the week and ran his finger down the column, and his finger stopped. The 14th of May. Catherine had been at the Wilson farm the whole of that day, and half the night, helping bring Mrs. Wilson's child into the world, a hard birth breach the doctor 12 miles off, and not come in time. Half the women of the district had been in and out of that house. He could name 6 off the top of his head, who'd swear to it on any book you put in front of them. The letter put her somewhere else entirely on the 14th of May, in arms that were not his. On the one day a dozen women had watched her kneel on a farmhouse floor and turn a breech baby with her own 2 hands and not lose either mother or child. The letter was wrong. The letter was wrong, which meant the letter was made, which meant Ethan sat down hard in the chair and the floor seemed to tilt under it, and he gripped the arms the way a man grips the rail of a pitching deck. He made himself reason it through slow because reasoning was the only floor he had left to stand on, and he could feel even that going soft. A forged letter wants to convince. So it speaks of a real day, a checkable day, a day the reader can confirm against his own knowledge. That's what makes the trap shut. Whoever made this had reached for a date that ought to have been unaccountable, a date she'd have no clean answer for. But they hadn't known about the Wilson child. They couldn't have. The woman had gone into her pains a full week early, sudden, no soul expecting it, Catherine sent for in the dark before dawn by a boy on a mule. No man planning this scheme in advance could have known to steer clear of the 14th. No man unless he'd had the letters already written, dated, sealed, and lying in wait weeks before that baby ever drew breath. Unless he'd had them made up early and held them back ready and only sprung them when the moment came ripe. Someone who'd planted the powder long before he chose to light it. God in heaven, Ethan said to the empty room. And the empty room, which had been her room too, which still held the chair she'd argued him into facing the window, gave him nothing back. He thought of her at the table the night before folding her hands. I was alone with your silence. He thought of her in the doorway. You wanted the proof more than you wanted me. He had taken every word of it for the brass of a guilty woman brazening it out. He saw now it had been the only other thing it could ever have been, a person telling the plain truth to a man too afraid of being wrong to hear a word of it. For he saw finally what he had truly been afraid of. It had not been her guilt. Her guilt was the easy thing. Her guilt cost him only a wife and a man could live. Having lost a faithless wife, the whole county would say he'd done right. No. He had been afraid of her innocence, because her innocence cost him everything he'd let himself become these 2 years past. Her innocence meant the careful, certain righteous magistrate had been led by the nose like a market calf had signed away. The one true thing in his life, on a forger's word, had stood in his own study and refused his wife the simple mercy of a question. Her innocence meant he was not the man he'd spent his life believing himself to be. Ethan Caldwell put the letters down on the oak and put his face in his 2 hands, and for the first time since he was a boy, he did not know what manner of man he was. He stayed that way a long while. Long enough that the clerk knocked once, and hearing nothing went away again. Long enough that a lesser man might have found some comfortable reason to set the letters back in the drawer, to call the ink a coincidence, and the date a faulty memory, to let the thing he'd already done go on being done, because the undoing of it would cost too dear. He did not do that. Whatever else 2 years of Julian Mercer had rotted in him, it had not reached all the way down. The boy, who'd slept 9 nights in a colt's stall, was still in there somewhere. The man who'd named a charge to a killer's face without flinching. And that man got up finally out of the chair. He gathered the letters. He folded them careful and put them in his breast pocket against his heart, where the worst evidence a man ever carried ought to sit. He reached for his coat, and then he did the thing he should have done a month past the thing she had stood in his own doorway and all but begged him to do. He went to find his wife, and to ask her, not tell her, not charge her, ask her what had truly happened under his roof. But the manner was quiet in a new way when he came down the stairs, a hollow way, and he stopped at the bottom with his hand on the newel, and knew it before Mrs. Doyle came out of the kitchen, wringing her apron. "She's gone, sir," the old woman said. Her eyes were red, but her chin, he noticed, was as level as ever. Catherine's had been, and there was something in the way the housekeeper looked at him that he had never once seen in 40 years of her service. Something that was not quite contempt and not quite pity, and was the worse for being a stranger to him. "Gone this morning. On foot. Wouldn't take the carriage you offered. Said she'd rather walk." A pause exactly waited. "Said she'd rather walk than take one more thing from this house. On foot." Ethan's hand tightened on the newel. "Which way?" "Toward town, sir. Through the worst of it, I'd reckon by now." "The worst of—" "The town, sir," Mrs. Doyle said, and did not soften it. "They had the tail before she had her shoes on. You'd know how that comes about better than I would. A tail don't carry itself that fast on its own legs." Ethan looked at the old woman who had laid out his mother and understood that she knew, that she had perhaps always known, that every soul who had truly known Catherine had never for one moment believed it, and only he, who had loved her, who had married her against all counsel, who had keys to every locked room of his own life, only he had believed it. Because only he had been worked on. Only he had been the one Julian needed to turn. "Mrs. Doyle," he said, and his voice was not the magistrate's voice. It had gone to something younger and far less sure. "Was I a fool?" The old woman looked at him a long moment, and whatever mercy she might have shown a better behaved master, she did not show him now. "You were worse than a fool, sir," she said. "A fool don't know better. You did." She turned back toward her kitchen, and at the door she stopped and gave him the only kindness she had left to give, which was the truth. "She left something for you to find, I think, though she'd never say so. If you've come to your senses at last, and Lord knows it's late, sir. It's the latest a man ever came to them. Then go and look in the one place a careful magistrate would think to look. And ask yourself when you find what's there, how easy it was got at. That's all I'll say. That's all I can say, and keep the promise I made her." She went into the kitchen and shut the door. And Ethan Caldwell stood alone in the hollow quiet of the house he had built and shared and emptied with his dead wrong evidence, folded against his heart, and felt the full and final weight of what he had done come down on him all at once, the way a roof comes down, not slow, not in pieces, but entire in a single ruinous instant that takes the breath clean out of a man. He had judged her. He had been wrong. And no robe, no bench, no seat in the county, no signature lawful, and his would ever lift 1 ounce of that weight off him again. There was only one verdict left in the world that he had any care for now, and it was not his to hand down. It had already been handed down quiet in the doorway of his own study by a woman with her hands folded and the ink not yet dry on the page that had unmade them both. Remember that you wanted the proof more than you wanted me. He would remember it. He would carry it the way he now carried the letters folded small against the heart every day he had left to draw breath. And then he reached for his hat and went out the door she had walked out of to begin the only work that was left to a man who had thrown away the truth and meant somehow, however long it took, to earn the right to look it in the face again. The first room Catherine could rent in town was a single room above the chandler's shop, and she paid for it with the only money Julian Mercer had failed to take from her, the small purse her father had pressed into her hand on his deathbed and made her swear to tell no husband about. A woman ought to have one thing, old Hale had whispered, that no man knows the size of. She had thought it a sad, suspicious thing to say at the time. She'd been newly in love. She had not believed she would ever need a secret from a man who looked at her the way Ethan did. She counted the purse out on the chandler's floorboards that night. $11 and some coin. Enough to keep a roof over her for perhaps 6 weeks if she ate little, and she meant to eat little. 6 weeks to pull a thread she could not yet find. She was still counting when the knock came. It was a soft knock, a careful one, and Catherine's whole body went still over the coins because no one in this town had a soft, careful knock for her anymore. They had the loud fists of men come to gawk, or they had nothing at all. She opened the door a hand's width. It was Ada, the blacksmith's wife who had crossed the whole street that morning to keep from speaking to her. She stood in the dark of the stairs with a shawl up over her hair and a covered dish in her 2 hands, and her face was the face of a woman doing a thing she'd been telling herself all day she would not do. "I can't be seen," Ada said fast and low. "I can't. Catherine, my Tom, does business with half of them. She stopped. She pushed the dish forward. "It's only a pie. It don't mean nothin'. Don't you go thinkin' it means It means everything," Catherine said quietly. "Come in off the stairs." "I can't." "Then give me your hand a moment before you go." Ada hesitated. Then she put one rough red hand through the gap in the door, and Catherine took it and held it, and the blacksmith's wife began to cry in the way of a woman who has been holding it in since noon. "I crossed the street," Ada whispered. "I crossed the whole street, and you stood up at my own husband's funeral supper, and you helped me wash the dishes after with your good dress on, and I crossed the street like you was a leper. You were afraid. There's no shame and fear, Ada. The shame's in the man who made you afraid. They're saying such things." Ada's grip tightened. "You don't know the half of what they're saying down there. And Catherine, there's worse. There's worse comin', and I shouldn't tell you, and I can't not tell you." She glanced back down the dark stairs. Mercer was at the courthouse this afternoon, with papers. My Tom shoes the bailiff's horse, and the bailiff talks when he's waiting. Mercer's not done with you. He's filed something new. Catherine's hand did not move in Ada's, but something behind her eyes went cold and bright and very awake. "Filed what?" she said. "I don't know the lawyer words. Tom didn't neither, but the bailiff said—" Ada swallowed. "The bailiff said it weren't enough for Mercer that you was divorced and disgraced. He said Mercer wants you charged, wants the money you was meant to have stole brought before the magistrate as a true crime. So's it ain't just your name, so's it's your liberty." The room seemed to draw in close around the 2 women. "He wants me tried," Catherine said slowly. For theft. And the bailiff said something I didn't understand, and I've been turning it over all the way up your stairs." Ada's brow knotted with the effort of carrying a thing she could not read. "He said it's clever what Mercer's done. He said by charging you, Mercer forces the magistrate to sit the case, forces Mr. Caldwell to be the judge of his own wife." And the bailiff laughed and said either way, Mercer wins. Either the magistrate convicts his own wife and breaks his own heart, proving he was right, or he lets her off, and the whole county says he's soft. He's bought, he's a man who can't judge straight where his own bed's concerned, and a magistrate folks won't trust. Ada stopped. "Is a magistrate folks will replace—" Catherine finished very low. And there it was, the whole of it all at once, the way she'd seen the shape of it on the drive that morning when Julian said you were just the door. She had thought the divorce was the end of his design. It was not even the middle of it. The divorce had only opened the door. The trial was the room he'd wanted all along, a room in which Ethan Caldwell was destroyed no matter which way he ruled, and the magistrate's seat came open for whatever man Julian Mercer chose to set in it. She was not the prize. She had never been the prize. She was the lever, and Ethan was the stone the lever was set to lift. Ada. Catherine pressed the woman's hand once and let it go. You've done a brave thing tonight, and I'll never name you for it, not if they put me in irons. Go home. Kiss your Tom. Forget you climbed these stairs. She paused. But if you ever hear another word from that bailiff, any word, you leave a mark on my door. A chalk mark low where no one looks. I'll find you after dark. Will you do that? Ada nodded, wiping her face. You're not afraid, she said wonderingly, the same thing Julian had said, the same thing the whole county would come to say. Catherine, they're coming to take everything you got left, and you're standing there like a body fixing to win. I'm not standing like a body fixing to win, Catherine said. I'm standing like a body that's already lost everything a person can lose and found out the strangest thing on the other side of it. She almost smiled. There's nothing left for them to threaten me with. That makes me the only free soul in this whole rotten county. Go home, Ada. The blacksmith's wife went, and Catherine stood alone with a pie going cold in her hands and a charge of theft coming for her liberty, and she did the thing she always did when the ground gave way beneath her. She sat down, and she made a list of what she knew, and she began to plan. The ink was from his office. The key was in her sewing box open to the parlor. Lillian Grant had sat alone in that study for half an hour with the door shut. And the letters spoke of the 14th of May, a day she could prove with a dozen witnesses she'd spent on her knees on the Wilson farmhouse floor. That last was the thread. She was nearly sure of it now. Whoever forged the letters had reached for the 14th because it ought to have been a blank day, an unaccountable day. They had not known about the Wilson baby coming early, which meant the letters were written before the 14th, before anyone knew that birth would happen, written and dated and held in waiting, then, which meant there was a window of days, a narrow findable window in which the forging had to have been done. And in a town this size, a body could not move through a narrow window of days without being seen by someone. She just had to find out who had seen Lillian Grant and when and where. She blew out her candle to save it and lay down in her clothes on a strange bed in a rented room, and for the first time in 3 years, she did not lie awake wondering what she had done to deserve a husband's silence. She lay awake plotting the ruin of the man who had built the lie, and she found to her own faint surprise that she slept the better for it. The truth she had told the boardwalk was a slow horse. She had simply neglected to mention that she intended to go out and meet it on the road. Across the same dark, Ethan Caldwell was not sleeping either. He had ridden into town that afternoon to find her and had found instead the whole of what he'd done laid out before him in the faces of the people on the street. He had ridden down the main road expecting nothing in particular, and the road had gone quiet ahead of him the way it always went quiet for the magistrate. But it was a different quiet now. It was the quiet of people who have just been talking about a thing and stop when the thing's own author rides into view. He had reined up outside the Chandlers without knowing she was above it, and a knot of men outside the tavern had watched him, and one of them, Pruitt, the young one with the wet mouth, had touched his hat with a slowness that was just barely on the right side of insolence. "Evenin', magistrate," Pruitt had said. "Reckon you'll be wantin' the whole business handled proper. Mercer says it's goin' before the bench. Says you'll sit it yourself." A pause weighed to the ounce. "That'll be a sight, won't it? A man judgin' the woman he just put out his door. Folks'll come from 3 counties for that." And Ethan had understood, sitting his horse in the failing light, 2 things at once. The first was that the town already knew there would be a trial, knew it before he did, which meant Mercer had filed it and let it be talked of before a word reached the magistrate's own ear, so that Ethan would learn of his own coming role from the mouth of a Pruitt on a tavern porch. The second was worse. The second was that he could not refuse to sit it. If he stepped down from the case, the county would say he'd done it out of guilt, out of softness, out of a husband's shame, and Mercer would have what he wanted, regardless a magistrate who flinched from his own bench. But if he sat it, he would have to judge Catherine in open court. He would have to sit above her in the robe, and weigh forged letters he now knew were forged in front of a town hungry to watch him do it. Mercer had built a door, with no room behind it, that did not end in Ethan's ruin. He had ridden home in the dark, understanding at last, and far too late, exactly the quality of the mind he had spent 2 years calling friend. Now he sat in his study with the letters out again, and a single candle, and a thing taking shape in him that he had not felt in years. Not fear. He'd had his fill of fear. Something harder and cleaner setting up in his chest like mortar going off. If Mercer wanted a trial, Ethan thought, then Mercer would get a trial. But Mercer had made one error in his arithmetic, the same error proud men always made with Ethan Caldwell. Mercer had reckoned the magistrate would either convict out of pride or acquit out of love, and either way be ruined. He had built his whole machine on the certainty that Ethan would behave like a husband. He had forgotten that Ethan Caldwell had been something before he was ever Catherine's husband, and something before he was Mercer's friend. He had been a man who could not abide a forged document. A man who set a lie in front of him, and given time enough and rope enough, would pull it apart strand by strand if it took him the rest of his natural life. Mercer had handed him a trial. A trial meant evidence. A trial meant witnesses under oath. A trial meant a courtroom in which Ethan Caldwell, who knew the law the way a blacksmith knows iron, would be permitted to ask questions. He picked up his pen. He did not write to Catherine. He had not yet earned the right, and he knew it, and the knowing was a discipline he set on himself like a penance. Instead, he wrote 3 short letters. One to the doctor who'd been 12 miles off the night the Wilson child came breech. One to a man in Richmond who kept the records of which justices sat which days to fix, beyond dispute, where the magistrate himself had been on the 14th of May. And one to a chemist he knew in the capital, a fussy, precise little man who had once testified for him about the composition of a poison, asking whether a man could swear under oath, and to a certainty that 2 inks came from the same pot. He sealed all 3. He sat a moment with his hand flat on them. Then he did a thing he had not done since he was a boy, at his mother's knee. He bowed his head over his own desk in the candlelight, and he asked of whatever might be listening only this, not to be forgiven. For he did not think he had the right to ask forgiveness yet, but to be given time enough to set it right before the harm became past setting. He did not know as he asked it that the time he was praying for was already running shorter than he feared. He did not know that Julian Mercer, 2 miles off in his own fine parlor, had foreseen exactly this, had foreseen that a wronged magistrate might find his spine again, and had already taken steps to see that no doctor, no chemist, and no Richmond clerk would arrive to testify in time. The trap, you see, had a second set of jaws, and both men in this story believed the other was the one who had been caught. Only one of them was right. The summons reached Catherine at the Chandlers 2 mornings later, brought up the stairs by a bailiff who would not meet her eye, and read aloud in a flat hurry, as though the words might stain his mouth. The people against Catherine Hale, late Caldwell. Theft of estate monies to the value of $500. To be tried before the magistrate's bench at the county seat the 3rd Monday of the month. "You're to have a lawyer," the bailiff mumbled. "If you can find one'll take you. And if none will, then you speak for yourself, ma'am, such as the court allows a woman to." He could not get back down the stairs fast enough. Catherine read the summons through twice. Then she set it on the windowsill, and she went to find a lawyer, and she discovered before noon exactly what Julian Mercer had already arranged for her to discover. There were 4 lawyers within a day's ride of the county seat. The first was in Mercer's pocket outright, and did not trouble to hide his smirk. The second had a wife who took tea with Lillian Grant, and would not so much as let Catherine through the door. The third heard her out, went pale, and said in an honest, frightened voice that he had 3 children and a practice to keep, and could not be the man who stood up in open court against the whole weight of the county's good opinion. And he was sorry, he was truly sorry, and he shut the door gently rather than hard, which was somehow worse. The fourth was old and half-blind and drunk by 2 in the afternoon, and told her he'd defend the Queen of Sheba for the right fee, but could no longer read his own hand, let alone a forged one. By evening, Catherine understood that she would stand in that courtroom alone. She climbed her stairs, and she sat on her strange bed, and for one long moment, one only, She let herself feel the full size of it. No money, no name, no lawyer. A town that had already convicted her over its suppers. A charge that could put her in a cell. And on the bench, robed in the law, the very man who had thrown her out his door. She put her face in her hands. Not weeping. Just holding her own head a moment, the way you hold a thing you're afraid might come apart. And into that lowest moment came a second knock at her door. Soft. Careful. She did not move at first. She did not think she could bear another kindness, and she was certain she could not bear another threat. The knock came again. And then a voice through the wood that stopped her breath, for it was not Ada's, and it was not a bailiff's, and it was not anyone she had braced herself to hear. "Mrs. Caldwell." Old, dry, precise. "It's Doyle, ma'am. Mrs. Doyle. I've walked 4 miles in the dark, and I'd be obliged not to do it for nothing, so open the door before some soul sees me on these stairs, and we're both ruined fresh." Catherine opened the door. The housekeeper stood there in her plain black, breathing hard from the climb, a market basket over her arm, and her level chin came up the moment she saw Catherine's face. "You've been letting yourself despair," Mrs. Doyle said, stepping in and shutting the door behind her. "I can see it on you. Well, stop it. I didn't walk 4 miles to comfort a woman who's giving up. I walked 4 miles because I'm not giving up, and I'll be damned at my age if I'll do the not giving up alone. Mrs. Doyle, you can't be seen here. Your place. My place." The old woman set her basket on the table with a small, definite thump. "I have kept my place 40 years, Mrs. Caldwell. I held my tongue when his mother was cruel, and I held it when his first wife wept, and I held it the morning you walked out that door with one bag, because you told me to, and you were right to, and I held it then for your sake, and not for his. But there's a difference between holding your place and selling your soul, and I have found these last days exactly where that line falls in me." She drew a breath. "I came to tell you 3 things, and then I'll walk my 4 miles back, and you'll never say I was here. Mrs. Doyle. 3 things. Listen." The housekeeper held up one finger. "The first. He knows. The master. He's worked it out, the ink, the date, all of it. I watched him do it. He sat in that study white as ash, and I heard him say God in heaven to an empty room, and a man don't say that over a wife, he still believes a thief. He knows you're innocent, Mrs. Caldwell. I'd swear to it." Something moved through Catherine that she did not let reach her face. "That changes nothing," she said. "If he knows and still lets the trial come, he's not letting it come. That's the second thing." A second finger. "He's fighting it. Quiet. He's sent away 3 letters. I posted them myself. I read the directions on them with these own eyes before I dropped them. A doctor, a clerk in Richmond, and some chemist fellow in the capital. He's gathering, ma'am. He means to stand up in his own court and tear that case to flinders. And I don't think he cares one whit that the whole county will see him do it for the woman he put out his door." Catherine sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. "He's going to defend me," she said, "from his own bench. He's going to try. He can't." Catherine's voice was strange. "Mrs. Doyle, don't you see that's the trap. That's the whole trap. Mercer doesn't fear Ethan acquitting me. He's counting on it. The moment the magistrate stands up and defends his own divorced wife in open court, every soul in 3 counties will say, 'Caldwell's lost his reason over a woman that he's not fit to hold the bench, that his judgment can't be trusted.' Mercer doesn't need me convicted. He needs Ethan seen breaking his own neck to save me. That ruins him surer than any verdict." She pressed her hands together. "If Ethan fights for me from that bench, he destroys himself, and that's precisely what Mercer wants. The kinder Ethan is to me in that courtroom, the more completely he hands Mercer the victory." The 2 women looked at each other in the small candlelit room, and the full and terrible cleverness of it sat down in the silence between them like a third presence. "Then what in God's name," Mrs. Doyle said at last very quietly, "is a body to do if his fightin' for you damns him and his not fightin' damns you?" And Catherine Caldwell, who had stood at her father's grave with her chin level, who had signed her name without a tear, who had faced down a whole boardwalk and never raised her voice, sat on the edge of a rented bed and felt for the first time the real architecture of the cage close around her. Because Mrs. Doyle had named it exactly. If Ethan defended her, he fell. If he did not, she fell. Mercer had built a machine in which the only two people who knew the truth could not both survive the speaking of it, unless... The candle guttered, and in the wavering of it, something began to turn over in Catherine's mind, slow at first, then faster, then with the awful gathering speed of a thing falling into place. "Mrs. Doyle," she said, "what was the third thing you said 3? Oh." The old woman fished in her basket. "The third's the smallest, and I near forgot it for the other 2. But it troubled me, so I brought it." She drew out a folded scrap of paper, an ordinary thing, a torn corner. "When I was cleaning the study after he'd gone to town, I was putting the letters back in order, the way he'd left them. He'll know I touched them. I don't care anymore, and I found this fallen down behind the drawer. It ain't in your hand, and it ain't in his. It's a list. Looks like nothing. Looks like a body practicing." She handed it across. "But I kept thinking, who sits in another man's study and practices?" Catherine took the scrap to the candle. It was a list of words. The same words over and over, written 8 times, 10 times each, a little smoother than the last. Account. Received. Catherine. Faithfully. Account. Received. A hand learning to be a hand practicing the shapes of words it meant to set later into letters that would damn a woman. And it was not Lillian Grant's hand. Catherine had seen Lillian Grant's hand on 100 dinner invitations, and this was nothing like it. This was a finer hand, a cleverer hand, a hand that had drilled itself patient and exact. But there at the very bottom of the scrap, where a person stops minding themselves because they think the practice is done, there one word had been written, not in the careful forging hand, but in the writer's own. A single word dashed off in impatience in the natural hand of whoever had sat in Ethan Caldwell's study and rehearsed a woman's ruin. One word. And Catherine knew that word. She had seen that exact crossing of the T, that exact impatient tail on the I 100 times on cards laid down across her own husband's table, on the corners of notes left for Ethan, on the flyleaf of a book of poems he had once smilingly pressed upon her as a gift. The word was yours. And the hand was Julian Mercer's. Catherine sat very still with the scrap in her fingers and the candle throwing her shadow huge against the wall, and Mrs. Doyle watched her face change, watched the despair go out of it entirely, watched something come into it that the old woman would describe 4 miles later in the dark of her own kitchen as the look of a body who has just been handed the one tool she needed and means now to use it on someone. "Mrs. Doyle," Catherine said softly. He didn't trust Lillian Grant to forge them well enough. She planted the key and let him in, but she hadn't the hand for the letters. So he did them himself, here in this study where the right ink was. He sat in my husband's chair and practiced my ruin until his hand was smooth, and then when he thought the practice was over, he forgot himself for one word. She looked up. "This is the thread. This is the corner he left showing. I told him on the drive he'd left one, and he laughed at me. He won't laugh when this is read out under oath. Then we've got him." Mrs. Doyle's old eyes blazed. "We've got the devil dead to rights." "No." Catherine's voice was quiet and absolute, and it stopped the old woman cold. "We have got a scrap of paper that I cannot put into evidence, Mrs. Doyle. Think. I am the accused. If I stand up in that court and produce a paper that conveniently damns the very man who accused me, a paper found so, I'll claim behind a drawer by a servant loyal to me who in that room will believe it for one breath. They'll say, I forged it myself. They'll say you forged it for me. It'll hang us both and free him cleaner than ever." She set the scrap down on the table with terrible care. "This is the truth. But the truth in a hostile court spoken by a ruined woman is worth less than a clever lie spoken by a respected man. I learned that the day Ethan held the papers instead of my hand. The candle burned. The old woman's face fell. Then it's no good to us, Mrs. Doyle said. It's everything to us, Catherine said. But not as a thing I produce. A thing I produce is poison. A thing he produces. And here at last something that was very nearly a smile touched her mouth. The first true one in days, A thing the magistrate himself draws out in open court, by his own hand having been led to look exactly where it lies. That is a different matter altogether. That the county will believe. They'll believe their own magistrate before they'll believe me, every soul of them. It's the cruelest thing in the world, and it's the only road through, and I see it now, all of it end to end. She stood. The despair was wholly gone from her, burned off like morning fog, and in its place was the cold, clear thing that had frightened Julian Mercer on the drive without his quite knowing why. "I cannot save myself in that courtroom," Catherine said, "and Ethan cannot save me without damning himself. So neither of us is going to try to do the thing Mercer is braced for. We're going to do the one thing he can't have planned for, because it's the one thing his whole scheme proves he never understood about either of us." "And what's that, ma'am?" Mrs. Doyle whispered. Catherine looked at the scrap of paper, and then at the 4 dark miles of window glass beyond which a man sat in a study, writing letters to a doctor and a clerk and a chemist, not knowing that the letters would never arrive, not knowing that 2 miles further off another man had already seen to that, not knowing that his own wife had just found the single thread that could undo it all, and meant to put it into his hands without his ever knowing she had touched it. "We're going to trust each other," Catherine said, from across a courtroom, without one word passing between us. "He'll have to read what I leave him the way he should have read me from the start, by looking and asking and not assuming. And if he can do that, if he can do in that courtroom the one thing he failed to do in his own study, then we walk out of it. Free, the both of us, and Julian Mercer hangs in the snare he built for us." She drew a breath. "And if he can't, if he assumes one last time, the way he assumed about the papers, then we both go down, and Mercer wins everything, and I'll have put the rope in my own hands." She folded the scrap and pressed it into Mrs. Doyle's palm and closed the old fingers over it. "You have to get this back," she said. "Tonight. Behind that drawer, exactly where it fell, exactly as you found it, not a hair different. He has to find it himself. He has to believe he found it by his own searching. It cannot ever have passed through my hands or yours. Do you understand me? If he knows we touched it, it's worthless. If he finds it clean, it's everything." Mrs. Doyle looked down at the small folded thing in her fist, and then up at the woman the whole county had thrown away, and the old housekeeper's level chin trembled for the first time that night. 4 miles back in the dark," she said, "to put the one weapon we've got back where we found it, and walk away from it, and pray a proud man stumbles on it. Yes. It's madness, Mrs. Caldwell. It's faith," Catherine said. "I've had cause to learn the difference lately, and there isn't one. Will you do it?" And Mrs. Doyle, 40 years in service, who had laid out the mother, and watched the marriage, and posted the letters, and walked 4 dark miles to refuse to despair, put the scrap of paper deep in her bodice, where no road agent and no curious eye would find it, took up her empty basket, and went to the door. "I'll do it," she said. "God help us all, I'll put it back. But you listen to me, Catherine Caldwell, and you mark it." She turned with her hand on the latch, and her old voice was iron. "If that man fails you twice, if he stands in that courtroom and assumes wrong about you one more time after everything, then you forget every soft thing you ever felt for him, and you save your own neck however you can, and you let him fall. You've bent enough for the Caldwells. You hear me? You've bent enough." "I hear you," Catherine said. But she did not promise. The old woman noticed that she did not promise, and carried the noticing of it down 4 dark miles, and could not for the life of her decide whether it was the best thing in Catherine or the most dangerous. The door closed. The stairs creaked under the old woman going down. And Catherine Caldwell stood alone in her rented room with a trial 3 weeks off a town against her, no lawyer, no name, and exactly one fragile, impossible plan that depended entirely on whether a proud man could learn in 3 short weeks to do the one thing he had never once managed in 3 years of marriage: to look at the truth in front of him, and ask, and not assume. She blew out the candle. In the dark she found she was not afraid. She had passed all the way through fear and out the far side of it, and what was left, she discovered, was the steadiest thing she had ever felt in her life. She had been a wife, and a suspect, and a cast-off, and a spectacle on a public street. Now, at last, she was something simpler, and far harder to break. She was a woman with a plan, and nothing left to lose, and 3 weeks to teach a man to see. She lay down in her clothes, and she did not dream. And across 4 miles of summer dark, Ethan Caldwell bent over his desk and sealed a 4th letter. He did not yet know would never be answered, and 2 miles past him, a lamp burned late in a fine parlor where Julian Mercer sat reviewing his own neat arrangements, and found them as he always found his arrangements good. 3 people, 1 truth between them, and a courtroom 3 weeks off where it would all at last be made to speak. The slow horse was on the road, and it was coming home faster than any of them knew. The letters never came back. Ethan waited a week, then 10 days, then 2, and not one of the 3 replies he had sent for arrived. Not the doctors, not the Richmond clerks, not the chemists. At first, he told himself the roads were slow in summer. By the 2nd week, he knew better, the way he knew a forged date from a true one, and he rode to the post office himself and stood at the counter and made the postmaster meet his eye. 3 letters, Ethan said, sealed with my own seal, posted a fortnight back. I'd know if they went out. The postmaster was a small, careful man who did business with everyone and crossed no one, and he looked at the magistrate the way a man looks at a flood coming up the road he has to drive on. They went out, magistrate. I'd swear it. I franked him myself. And the replies. No replies come in for you. None. I'd have brought him up myself, you know I would. The postmaster lowered his voice, though the office was empty. But I'll tell you a thing, since it's you, and you didn't hear it from me. The mail South's been handled queer this month. The writer changed. New man. Mercer's manfolk say Mercer recommended him to the line when the old writer took sick sudden. He swallowed. Old writer took sick real sudden, magistrate. Real convenient sudden. And Ethan Caldwell stood at the counter and felt the second jaw of the trap close neat and quiet around the throat of his whole defense. Mercer had not merely filed the charge. Mercer had seen before. Ethan had even thought it exactly how a magistrate finding his conscience would try to fight by sending for the witnesses who could prove the dates a lie. And Mercer had put his own man on the mail road to make certain not one of those witnesses ever learned he was wanted. The doctor 12 miles off did not know there was a trial. The Richmond clerk did not know his records were needed. The chemist sat in his capital laboratory with no notion that 2 inks waited to be sworn the same. Ethan had 3 weeks of work undone in a single sentence from a frightened postmaster. He rode home not in despair, but in a cold and terrible clarity, and the clarity told him a thing he did not want to know. He could not win this case with witnesses. Mercer had cut the witnesses off at the root. He could not win it with the letter's false dates alone, because without the doctor to swear to the Wilson birth, the date was only Ethan's word, and the county would say the magistrate was lying for the woman. He had 1 bench, 1 robe, 3 weeks gone to 10 days, and nothing left to fight with, but whatever he could find inside the 4 walls of his own house and his own ruined certainty. So he searched the house. He searched it the way he should have searched the case before he ever signed emptied out, assuming nothing, turning over the things a guilty woman would have hidden, and finding instead only the things an innocent one had left in plain sight. Her sewing box, dusty, the key to the accounts office, lying in it exactly where a careless wife leaves a key she has nothing to fear from. He stood over that box a long while. A guilty woman hides her key. An innocent woman never thinks to. He searched the study last, because the study was the hardest. Because the study still held the chair she'd faced toward the window, and the ledger she'd kept cleaner than his clerk, and the ghost of every evening she'd read to him while he pretended to mind his papers. He went through the desk drawer by drawer. He found nothing. He sat in his own chair defeated, and put his hand down flat on the desk, and his eye fell by no design by the plain accident a careful man's eye makes when it has stopped trying on a gap behind the bottom drawer where the wood had warped a hair from true. There was something fallen down behind it. Ethan worked it loose with 2 fingers. A torn scrap. A list of words written over and over, each smoother than the last. Account. Received. Catherine. Faithfully. A hand teaching itself to be another hand. He knew at once what he was looking at. He had broken too many forgers in his years on the bench not to know the look of a man practicing a borrowed hand. Someone had sat in this very room, in this very chair perhaps, and drilled the shapes of the words that would later damn his wife. Someone with the patience to do it, and the access to do it, and the right ink at his elbow to do it with. And at the bottom of the scrap, in a different hand, quicker, careless, the writer's own hand breaking through where he'd stopped minding himself, one word. Yours. Ethan had seen that word 1,000 times. On cards laid across this very table. On the corners of notes left for him by a friend. On the flyleaf of a book of poems that friend had once pressed smiling into Catherine's hands. The crossing of the T, the impatient tail on the Y. Julian Mercer's hand. Ethan Caldwell sat in his study with the scrap in his fingers and did not move for a long, long time. He understood, holding it, that he was holding the whole truth at last, that Mercer had not merely carried the letters. Mercer had made them here in this house, in this room, with the ink that pointed back to this room, because Mercer had been too clever by half and used what lay nearest to hand. He understood that Lillian Grant had only opened the door and that the work behind it was Mercer's own. He understood, too, with a magistrate's cold instinct, the thing Catherine had understood 3 weeks before him in a rented room, that this scrap was worth everything and could prove nothing. Because how had he come by it? Found behind a drawer in his own house by his own hand, 3 weeks after he'd thrown his wife out the door, he now meant to clear her name from. Mercer's lawyer would tear it apart in a sentence. The magistrate found it himself. Did he, after deciding his own ruling was wrong? How fortunate, how very convenient that the magistrate, having put his wife out, should now discover a paper in his own desk that unmakes the whole case. Who is to say the magistrate did not write it himself to save the woman he never stopped wanting? The scrap produced by Ethan was poison. It would damn him as a love-blind fool and free Mercer cleaner than ever. He saw the whole shape of it. Then the full cruelty of the machine. And he saw that Catherine, wherever she was, however she had spent these 3 weeks, must have seen it long before him, because the key had been left in plain sight, because the dust around the sewing box had been undisturbed, because everything in this house had been left exactly precisely as a guilty woman would never leave it, and a clever innocent one would leave it for him to find. She had not run, she had not hidden a thing. She had laid the whole truth out across his house like a hand of cards, face up, and walked away, and trusted him. Trusted him, who had failed her once already in this very room, to come back and read it right. Ethan put the scrap in his breast pocket, with the letters against his heart, and he bowed his head over the desk. And this time, he did not pray for time. The time was gone. He prayed instead for the one thing he had never been good at, the thing that had cost him everything the wit to do in the courtroom, what he had failed to do in this study. To look, to ask, to not assume, to not. 3 days later, the county seat filled up, the way Pruitt had promised it would, with folks come from 3 counties to watch a magistrate judge the woman he'd put out his door. They packed the courtroom and they packed the street outside it. Lillian Grant had a seat near the front in a new bonnet, the picture of a respectable woman dragged regretfully to witness another's shame. The Pruitts came in a body. Ada sat far at the back with her shawl up and her hands knotted in her lap, and her Tom beside her, looking like a man who'd been argued into something against his judgment. And Mrs. Doyle stood against the rear wall, in her plain black level-chinned, having walked her miles one final time. Catherine came in last alone with no lawyer at her side, and the room drew its breath as one. She wore her plainest dress and her own braided hair, and she walked up the aisle the way she'd walked the boardwalk 3 weeks past. Easy, unhurried, her chin level, and she took the defendant's place and folded her hands and looked at no one. She did not look at Lillian Grant. She did not look at the crowd come to feed. She looked once briefly at the empty bench where the magistrate would sit, and then she lowered her eyes and waited, and the waiting of her filled the room more than any weeping could have. Julian Mercer sat at the prosecutor's table in a fine dark coat, and he was, as he was always, the most at-ease man in any room. He had brought a lawyer to do the actual speaking, a sleek imported fellow named Vance. But it was Mercer. The room watched Mercer, who leaned and murmured and shaped the thing. And Mercer who, when Catherine took her place, gave her a small grave nod of such perfect counterfeit sorrow that 3 women in the gallery sighed at his decency. Then the magistrate came in, and the whole room rose, and Ethan Caldwell took the bench to judge his own wife. He did not look at Catherine either. He had decided he would not, could not, dared not, until he had earned it. He took his seat in the robe, and he set his face the way he set it for any case, and only Mrs. Doyle, who had known him 40 years, saw what it cost him, saw the thing working under the stillness, like water under ice. Vance opened for the prosecution, and he was good, and he was thorough, and he laid the whole false thing out, brick by brick. The letters in the wife's hand, the sums drawn against the estate, the key she held to the accounts office, the dates on which the household could not account for her. He read the worst letter aloud, the May letter, and the courtroom shifted and muttered, and a woman near Lillian Grant said shameless loud enough to carry, and Catherine sat through all of it with her hands folded and did not flinch. "The defense," Vance said at last, with the satin courtesy of a man who knows there is none, "may proceed. Though I understand the accused has secured no counsel." He let that sit, let the cruelty of it warm the room. "She will speak for herself then, as the law graciously permits." Catherine rose. And here is where Julian Mercer made the second error of his life, though he would not know it for an hour yet. He had braced for one of 2 things. He had braced for a guilty woman to weep and break which would convict her, or he had braced for the magistrate to rise up and defend her against all reason which would ruin him. He had built his whole machine to win on either outcome. He had not braced for what Catherine actually did. "I have no lawyer," Catherine said, and her voice carried clear and level to the back wall where Ada sat. "I could find none who'd take me. I'll not pretend I don't know why. So I'll not give a speech, for I've no gift for them, and you've no wish to hear one from me." She paused. "I'll ask leave instead to question the witnesses myself. The law permits even a woman that much. And I've only 3 questions in all the world put to 3 people, and then I'll sit, and you may do with me as you please." The room rustled. Vance looked to Mercer. Mercer gave the smallest nod, amused generous, a man too sure of his hand to fear a few questions from a doomed woman. "The court permits it," Ethan said. It was the first time he had spoken, and his voice came out steadier than he'd feared. "Call your witness." "I call Mrs. Lillian Grant." A murmur. Lillian Grant rose in her new bonnet, composed and faintly martyred, and took the witness stand, and was sworn, and folded her gloved hands, and waited to be wronged. "Mrs. Grant," Catherine said, "I'll not keep you. 1 question only. In the last week of May, the week before my husband rode to Richmond, you took tea at Caldwell Manor, did you not, while I was away at the Wilson farm?" A small ripple. Lillian Grant's chin lifted. "I may have. I take tea at a great many houses. I can't be expected to recall." "You waited near 2 hours, the housekeeper says, in a house where you weren't expected, and I never came. And you asked to wait, not in the parlor, but in my husband's study, because the parlor draft caught your chest." Catherine's voice did not rise. It never rose. "Do you recall that Mrs. Grant, the draft, the study, the closed door, and Lillian Grant, who had the spite but not the wit, exactly as Catherine had said in a rented room 3 weeks before, made her mistake? She had not been told this question was coming. Mercer had not foreseen it, and so had not schooled her against it. And caught flat, Lillian Grant did the thing a guilty woman of small wit always does. She denied too much. "I was never in that study," she said too quickly, too loud. "Not once, not for 1 moment. Whoever says I was is a liar. And if it's the old servant, then she's a liar, bought by her—" A gloved hand flung toward Catherine. "And I'll not sit here and—" "I never said how long," Catherine said quietly. "I never said you were in it long. I said you asked to wait there. You're the one who's told this court you were never in it at all, not for 1 moment before I'd accused you of so much as a minute." She turned unhurried to the bench, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she let her eyes rest fully on her husband's face. "Magistrate, the housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle, stands at the back of this room. She is sworn to the truth, as we all are. I'd ask the court, not me the court, to put to her 1 question. How long was Mrs. Grant alone in that study? And whether the door, which is never shut, was shut when she left it. The room had gone very quiet. Ethan Caldwell looked at his wife across the courtroom, and for one suspended moment, the whole of 3 years and 3 weeks hung between them. Every silence, every assumption, the papers on the table, the pen set down without a tear. She was not asking him to defend her. She had been too clever for that, had seen the trap in it before he had. She was asking him only to look, to ask the question, to do here the one thing he had failed to do in his study with the papers in his hand. She was handing him the case the only way it could be handed, not as her plea, but as his question. "Mrs. Doyle," Ethan said, "stand forward and be sworn." Vance was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is most irregular. The accused cannot direct the court to." "The accused did not direct the court," Ethan said. "The accused asked the court to seek the truth, and the court will seek it. Sit down, Mr. Vance." And there was enough of the old iron in it that Vance sat, and Mercer at the table stopped smiling for the first time that day. Mrs. Doyle came forward in her plain black, and was sworn, and her level chin did not waver. "How long," Ethan said, "was Mrs. Grant alone in my study that week in May?" "Half an hour, magistrate. Closer to 40 minutes by the bread I had rising. And the door was shut when she'd gone. That door's never shut in 40 years, but when there's a body in it that don't want seeing." The room exhaled all at once. "That proves nothing," Vance cried. "A woman waited in a study. Women wait in studies. Where is the crime in tea and a draft?" "There is no crime in tea," Catherine agreed, still standing, still level. "And I'll not claim there is. I said 3 questions to 3 people. That was the first, and it's answered, and I leave the court to weigh what it's worth. Here's the second." She turned. "I called Julian Mercer." The whole room turned with her. Mercer rose, unhurried, perfectly composed, the very picture of a reluctant gentleman, and took the stand, and was sworn, and looked at Catherine with that grave counterfeit sorrow that had moved 3 women to sigh an hour past. He was not afraid. Catherine could see he was not afraid. He believed still that he held every card, that she was a doomed woman flailing, that whatever she asked, he could turn aside with the smile that always held. "Mr. Mercer," Catherine said, "you carried these letters to my husband. You'll not deny it. The whole county knows it." "I did," Mercer said gravely, "to my lasting sorrow. I'd have given much to be spared that duty. But a man's friend is owed the truth, however it grieves them both." "The truth? Yes." Catherine let that word sit a moment. "Then let me ask you about the truth, Mr. Mercer, since you prize it so. These letters speak of a meeting on the 14th of May. You've read them. You read that line to my husband yourself, I think, the night you brought them." "I may have. I don't recall every—" "The 14th of May." Catherine did not let him finish. "Do you know where I was on the 14th of May, Mr. Mercer? With your—" He caught himself, gestured delicately at the letters on Vance's table. "The correspondence speaks for itself, Mrs. Caldwell. I'll not be cruel and say it aloud." "How kind!" And now, only now, something came into Catherine's voice that had not been there all morning. Not anger, not triumph, but a cold and quiet edge that made the front rows lean back without knowing why. "I'll say it aloud then, since you're too tender. On the 14th of May, I was on the floor of the Wilson farmhouse 12 miles from here, with my sleeves to the elbow, turning Hannah Wilson's child, which had come a week early, and breached the doctor not yet arrived. There were 9 women in and out of that house that day and night. 6 of them sit in this room. Mrs. Pruitt is one. Ask her." The courtroom erupted. Old Mrs. Pruitt, who had insulted Catherine over her father's grave, who hated her, still went scarlet because she could not lie under oath in a packed court with God and the county watching. And when the noise died, and Ethan said, "Is this so, Mrs. Pruitt?" the old woman pressed her lips white and said, grudging furious, unable to do otherwise, "It's so. She was there. All day. She caught the child." And sat down hard. "So the letter," Catherine said, into the ringing silence, "speaks of a meeting on a day when a dozen souls watched me deliver a baby 12 miles off. The letter is wrong. A woman writing secretly to a lover does not get the date of her own betrayal wrong, Mr. Mercer. But a man forging a letter weeks in advance, a man choosing what ought to be a blank, unaccountable day, that man might choose the 14th, not knowing a child would come early and put a dozen witnesses in the room. She let it land. The letter was written before the 14th, before anyone alive knew that birth would happen, which means it was written in advance, which means it was written by someone who meant to use it later. Speculation, Vance said, but his voice had lost its satin. Conjecture. The accused spins a tale. Then here is my third question, Catherine said, and it is not a tale and it is not mine to prove, and I'll ask the court to do the proving as the court did with the housekeeper. For I am only the accused, and nothing I produce will be believed, and well I know it. She turned fully to the bench. Magistrate, you have searched your house these 3 weeks. I know you have. It's your nature, it always was. I'll ask you one thing only, and then I'm done, and I'll take whatever this court hands me. Did you find anything behind the bottom drawer of your study desk? The room went so still that the flies could be heard at the window, and Julian Mercer on the witness stand went for the first time in the whole of his life the color of ash, because he understood all at once in that single question the thing he had missed. He had drilled his hand smooth in that study. He had practiced the borrowed letters until they were perfect. And somewhere in the practicing, he had torn off a scrap and let it fall, and forgotten it the way clever men forget the one thing, because they are so very pleased with everything else. He understood, watching Catherine's level face, that she knew about the scrap, that she had known for weeks, and that she had not produced it, had not dared produce it, because in her hands it was worthless, but had instead spent 3 questions building a courtroom in which the magistrate himself would be the one to draw it into the light. She had not sprung the trap. She had walked Ethan to it step by step in front of the whole county and put the spring in his hand. Ethan Caldwell looked at his wife, and then slowly he reached into the breast of his robe against his heart, where he had carried it for 3 days with the letters, and he drew out a torn scrap of paper, and he held it up so the courtroom could see it, and his voice when it came was the magistrate's voice, at last clean and certain and terrible. "I did," he said. "I found this, a scrap of paper fallen behind the drawer of my own desk in the house. Only a handful of souls had the run of this spring. It is a list of words written over and over, each smoother than the last. The work of a hand teaching itself to forge another hand. Account. Received. Catherine. Faithfully. The very words that appear in the letters laid on that table." He turned the scrap. And here at the bottom, in a different hand, the forger's own breaking through where he stopped minding himself a single word. "Yours." He looked up, and for the first time since the papers on the table, he looked Julian Mercer full in the face. "I have seen that hand 1,000 times, Mr. Mercer. Across my own card table. On notes you left me. On the fly-leaf of a book of poems you once gave my wife." He set the scrap down on the bench before him with terrible care. "This is your hand. You did not carry these letters. You made them. In my house. In my study. With my ink, which is why the ink pointed always back to that room, a thing that troubled me from the first, and that I was too great a fool and too well managed by you to follow. You sat in my chair and practiced the ruin of an innocent woman, and you left one scrap of it behind, and then you stood on a tavern porch and let a Pruitt tell me I'd have to judge her, because you reckoned I'd either break her heart or my own, and you'd have my bench either way." The courtroom had risen to its feet, a roar building in it, and Mercer was white and rising too, the smile gone, the satin gone, and for one instant, the flat cold thing under all his charm showed naked to the whole county. "You can't prove I wrote it," Mercer said, and his voice cracked on the last word, and the crack was the most damning thing he'd done all day. "A scrap of paper. You found it yourself. You'd say anything, everyone knows you'd say anything for her, you fool, you besotted." "I would," Ethan said. "God help me, I would say anything for her. You reckoned on that. You built your whole house on it." He stood in his robe behind his bench. But I am not asking this court to take my word for whose hand this is. I would not in your place, and I'll not ask it here. I am asking only that the court do the one thing I failed to do in my own study 3 weeks past." He turned to Vance. "Mr. Vance, you're a careful man. Take this scrap and take any note in Mr. Mercer's hand that this court can lay hands on. There are a dozen in this very room in the pockets of men he's written to, and compare them. Letter by letter. The crossing of the T, the tail on the Y. Do it now in open court before us all so that it is no man's word against another's, but only the truth looking up at us off the page." And that was the thing Julian Mercer had never once reckoned on. Not the wife's tears, not the husband's love, but the magistrate doing at last in front of the whole county the plain, patient, careful work he had been famous for before Mercer ever taught him to read, with his fear laying 2 hands side by side and letting the truth speak for itself out loud, where no charm could turn it and no smile could hold against it. Vance took the scrap. Vance took the notes pressed forward by suddenly eager men in the gallery, men who'd had letters from Mercer, and wanted now to be seen on the right side of the street. Vance laid them on the table and bent over them, and the courtroom held its breath, and the comparing took perhaps 2 minutes and felt like an hour, and at the end of it the imported lawyer Vance straightened up and looked at the man who had hired him and looked away and said the only thing a careful man could say. "The hands are the same, Your Honor." The courtroom came down like a roof, and in the very middle of the roar, while the bailiffs moved and the gallery surged and Lillian Grant tried to make herself small in her new bonnet, and old Mrs. Pruitt sat scarlet and stunned at having been made against every wish of her heart, the instrument of the truth in the middle of all of it. Ethan Caldwell looked across the wreckage of his own courtroom at the woman he had put out his door, the woman who had not wept, who had not begged, who had laid the whole truth across his house face up and trusted a proud fool to read it right at last. And Catherine Caldwell looked back at him. She did not smile. There was too much between them yet for smiling. But she gave him one small nod level, and grave the same nod she had given on the drive to a man on a horse, the same nod she gave to the truth itself, when it finally slowly came home, down the long road to the door it had left from. He had looked. He had asked. He had not assumed. It was 3 weeks too late to save their marriage, and they both knew it, and that knowledge sat between them in the roaring room plainer than any word. But it was not too late for the truth. The truth had come home at last in open court, drawn into the light by the very hand that had once signed her away, and Julian Mercer, who had built a machine to ruin a magistrate no matter which way he turned, stood white and silent, and finished in the center of it. Undone, not by tears, and not by love, but by one torn scrap of his own clever, careless, unforgivable hand. The bailiffs took Julian Mercer that same hour, and the county that had come to watch a woman shamed stayed instead to watch a gentleman led out in irons. And there is no crowd on earth that turns so fast or so completely as a crowd that has just been shown. It cheered for the wrong man. They wanted suddenly to have always known. By nightfall, there was not a soul in 3 counties who would admit to having believed a word against Catherine Caldwell. The same mouths that had said shameless in the gallery now said they'd had their doubts all along, that Mercer was a sly one, that they'd never quite trusted that smile. Catherine heard it in the street the next morning and felt nothing about it at all which surprised her. She had thought vindication would taste of something. It tasted of nothing. It was only the truth come home late, and the truth owed her no sweetness for having been made to wait. But Ethan was not finished, and that was the thing the county had not reckoned on either. A lesser man cleared of having ruined his wife would have let the verdict be enough, would have let Mercer hang or rot, and called the books balanced. Ethan Caldwell sat the bench 3 more days that week and did the one thing that cost him the most, and that he would not be spared. He tried the whole of it root and branch in open court, and he made himself the first witness against his own folly. "Before this court hears another word," he said on the second morning with the robe on him and the county packed in tighter than before, "it will hear this. I am the magistrate of this county, and I held in my own hands the evidence that a forgery had been done, and I did not read it. I had the ink that pointed to my own study. I had a date a dozen women could disprove. I had a key left in plain sight where no guilty woman leaves a key. I had every thread a careful man needs, and I pulled not one of them because I had let a man teach me to read with my fear instead of my eyes. He paused, and the room did not breathe. I tell you this not to be forgiven. I have no claim on your forgiveness, and I'll ask none. I tell you because there is a woman in this county who lost her name and her home, and 3 weeks of her liberty's good standing, because the man whose whole office is judgment failed to judge. And before I sentence the man who built the lie, this court will hear, from my own mouth, the name of the fool who believed it. There was no sound in the courtroom, but old Mrs. Doyle against the back wall pressing her apron to her mouth. It was a strange thing to watch a powerful man strip himself bare in front of the very people he ruled, and the county did not know what to do with it. They had come prepared to forgive him easily, the way crowds forgive the powerful with a wink and a shrug, and a well any man might have. He would not let them. He named his own failure plainly 3 mornings running, and would not be talked out of it. And slowly, the easy forgiveness curdled in the gallery into something far more uncomfortable and far more real. A respect that had teeth in it. The respect a hard people grudgingly grant a man who refuses to let himself off the hook they'd happily have lifted him from. On the 3rd morning, Julian Mercer was brought up for sentence, and he had had 3 days in a cell to find his feet, and he had found them. The ash was gone from his face. He came up the aisle in irons with his chin level. He had learned that much from watching Catherine. The bitter irony of it. And when he stood before the bench, he looked up at Ethan with something that was almost the old smile. "Well, magistrate," Mercer said, easy carrying playing to the last house he would ever play to. "Here's a thing the county will chew on for a generation. The man who let me ruin his wife now sits in judgment on me for the ruining. There's justice for you. There's the law." He let it land in the gallery. Let the discomfort ripple. "You're no cleaner than I am, Ethan. You only got found out gentler. Every soul in this room knows you'd have signed that woman into a cell if I'd timed it half a week different. The only difference between us is which of us the truth happened to favor in the end. And it was a good thrust. A clever thrust. The thrust of a man who had spent his life learning exactly where the soft place was in another man, and putting the knife there." The gallery murmured. It was true after all. It was the one true thing Julian Mercer had ever said in open court, and he knew it, and he watched it work. Ethan let the silence stretch. When he spoke, he did not raise his voice. "You're right," he said. The murmur stopped. "You're right, and I'll not pretend you're not the way I pretended at so much else. If you'd timed it half a week different, there'd have been no Wilson child to set the date a lie, and I'd have had nothing to wake me, and I'd have judged her guilty and slept the sleep of a righteous man. That's the truth, and this court has heard me say worse of myself these 3 days, and I'll say this too." He leaned forward. "But here is where you've misjudged Mercer the same way you misjudged from the start, and you misjudge it even now with the irons on you. Because it's the one thing your whole clever life never let you understand. You think because I might have fallen. There's no difference between a man who falls and a man who builds the pit. You think because any man might be deceived, there's no difference between the deceived and the deceiver. You've staked your whole soul on there being no difference between those two, because if there's no difference, then you're no worse than the rest of us, and you can go to your cell telling yourself so." His voice dropped, and somehow the dropping carried farther than any shout. "There is a difference. It is the only difference that has ever mattered. I was a fool. You were a craftsman. I failed to see a lie. You sat in my chair and made one patient word by word until your hand was smooth. And the proof of the difference is this, that when I finally saw the truth, it broke me. And when you were finally caught in it, you reached at once for a way to drag one more soul down with you. That's not a small thing, Mercer. That's the whole of it. That's the line between us, and you'll have years in a cell to look for the place where it isn't. And you'll not find it, because it's not there." Bama says suarete. Julian Mercer's level chin did not waver. But something behind his eyes did some flat, cold thing, recognizing perhaps for the only time in its life that it had met a man it could not move. Ethan passed the sentence. It was a hard one, the hardest the law allowed for forgery and false witness, and the county would speak of it for years. And when it was done, and the bailiffs turned Mercer for the door, the man stopped and looked back, not at Ethan now, but at Catherine, who had come every morning and sat at the back and said nothing. "It was never about you," Julian Mercer said to her one last time, the same words he'd said on the drive 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. "I told you that. You should believe me now if you never did before. You were the door." He almost smiled. "Pity for both of us you turned out to be a door with a woman behind it after all." And they took him out. And that was the last Catherine Caldwell ever saw of the man who had unmade her life, and she found watching the door close on him that she did not hate him. Hate would have been a kind of debt, a thing she still owed him, a tie between them. She had spent her hate weeks ago in a rented room, and what was left now was only a great clean emptiness where the man had been. The way a wound healed leaves a place that no longer aches, but is no longer quite the same skin. Lillian Grant was dealt with too in the smaller way her smaller crime allowed. She had opened the door and planted no letter, and the law could not reach her the way it reached Mercer, but the county reached her instead, the way a small town reaches its own, with the slow shut door, the unanswered call, the conversation that stops when she enters. Within the season, the Grants sold their fine house and moved 2 counties off to start again, where the story had not yet arrived. And old Mrs. Pruitt, who had been made the unwilling instrument of the truth, never quite forgave Catherine for it, and went to her grave years later, still faintly resentful at having been forced against her own mean heart to do one decent thing. But all of that was the county's business, and the county would tend to it. The thing that remained the thing no verdict touched and no sentence settled was between a man and a woman, and it could not be tried in any court, and both of them knew it. He came to the Chandlers on the 4th evening. She had not asked him to. He had not sent word. He climbed the stairs the way Mrs. Doyle had climbed them, the way Ada had, and he knocked the soft, careful knock of a person who knows he has no right to the door he stands at. And Catherine knew his step before the knock, the way you know a thing you have slept beside for 3 years, and she stood a long moment with her hand on the latch before she opened it. He had left the robe behind. That was the first thing she saw. He stood in his plain coat with his hat in his 2 hands, the way he must have stood at her father's grave the day he first could not get her out of his head, and there was nothing of the magistrate left in him at all. There was only a man on a stair with his hat in his hands. "I won't come in," Ethan said. "I haven't come to come in. I've come to say a thing standing here, and then I'll go, and you needn't answer it, and you needn't ever let me up these stairs again." "Say it then." He looked at his hat. For a man who had stood 3 mornings in open court and named his own folly to a packed gallery, without flinching, he found this harder, and Catherine saw that he found it harder, and something in her that had gone hard as a fence post in the cold, these weeks shifted just slightly against her will. "I had it all," he said. "That's the thing I can't get past. Not that I was deceived. Any man can be deceived. Mercer was right about that much, and I've made my peace with having been a fool. I can live as a man who was fooled. What I can't—" His voice caught, and he mastered it. "What I can't live easy with is that I didn't need Mercer at all to do the worst of it. The worst of it I did alone. You stood in my study, and you asked me to ask you. You said it plain. Judge me out loud. Charge me to my face. And I held the paper instead of your hand. Mercer built the lie, Catherine. But I'm the one who chose the paper over you, and no scrap behind a drawer undoes that. I made that choice. There was a moment in that room, one moment where the whole of it could have turned, where all I had to do was set the paper down and say, 'Tell me,' and I didn't. And that moment is mine. That one's not Mercer's. That one I'll carry to the grave." Catherine stood in her doorway and did not speak for a long while. "Yes," she said finally. "You will." She did not soften it. She had softened things for 3 years in that house, for that man had tidied the room behind everyone, and held her tongue, and bent, and she was done with softening, and she let him have the truth bare, the way he'd made the county take his, You want me to tell you it's all right, she said. That any man would have done the same. That the lie was so good no one could have seen through it. Ada would tell you that. Half the county would tell you that now since it's safe to. But I won't, Ethan, because it isn't true. And you'd know I was lying, and we've had enough of comfortable lies between us to last 2 lifetimes. She held his eyes. It is not all right. You did me a wrong that no court can mend. And you did it not because Mercer was clever, but because in the one moment that mattered you wanted to be right more than you wanted to be kind. That's the truth. And I think you came up these stairs hoping I'd lift it off you, and I won't. I can't. It's yours. He named it himself the night he brought the letters. He said he gave you something easier to believe. But a man chooses what he finds easier to believe, Ethan. You chose. That's the whole of it. He took it. She watched him take it full in the chest, the way he'd taken everything these 3 days, and not look away, and not reach for an excuse. And it was the not reaching that did what no apology could have done. Because the old Ethan the magistrate, Ethan would have had a reason ready. This man only stood and bore it. I know, he said quietly. I didn't come up here to be lifted. I came up to tell you I know, so that you'd never have to wonder whether I understood the size of it. I do. I understand it better than you think, because I've had 3 weeks in a courtroom to count every inch of it. He turned his hat once in his hands. And to tell you one thing more, and then I'll go. The house is yours, the whole of it. I've signed it over the manor, the land, the holdings, all of it free and clear in your name, Catherine Hale, not Caldwell, your own name, the one Pruitt threw at you like a stone. It was always more yours than mine. You kept its books and ran its rooms and held it together while I sat on a bench believing forgeries. The papers are with the county clerk. You needn't see me to claim it. You needn't see me ever again. And that landed in Catherine in a way nothing else had. And for the first time in the whole long ordeal in the study, and on the drive and on the boardwalk and in the rented room, and through 3 mornings of trial for the first time, her level chin was not quite steady. You're giving me the manor, she said. I'm giving you back what was always yours. There's a difference. I've learned a great deal these weeks about the difference between giving a thing and giving a thing back. He set his hat on his head. I put you out of that house on a forgery on foot with 1 bag. The least a man can do having done that is see you have a door of your own that no one can ever put you out of again. It's not penance, Catherine. Penance would be for me. This is just the smallest piece of setting. Right what can be set, right. The rest of it. The moment in the study, the paper over the hand that can't be set right, and I'll not insult you by pretending a deed makes it even. He stepped back down a stair. Good night. I'm glad. His voice went rough. I'm glad the truth came home, even late, even at the cost it came at. The county will know what you are now. That's worth more to me than the manor ever was, and I've no right to be glad of it, and I am anyway. He turned to go down the stairs. Ethan! He stopped 3 stairs down, and did not turn the same way she had not turned in his study doorway a lifetime ago, and the echo of it was not lost on either of them. Why didn't you defend me? Catherine said. In the courtroom. You knew the truth before I asked the first question. Mrs. Doyle told me you'd worked it out weeks past. You could have stood up that first morning and cleared me with a word from the bench. You didn't. You let me ask my 3 questions. You let me walk you to it. Why? He was quiet a moment on the stair. Because you'd have known, he said. If I'd cleared you with the magistrate's word, you'd never have known whether I did it, because I'd truly seen the truth, or because I couldn't bear what I'd done and wanted it undone for my own sake. You'd have wondered the rest of your life whether I believed you or only needed to. So I waited. I made myself wait. I let you put the questions, and I answered them honest, and I drew the scrap out only when you'd built the room where it would be believed, so that when it was over, you'd know past all doubting that I cleared you, because the truth cleared you, and not because I willed it. He paused. You taught me that, Catherine. In the study. You said you wanted the evidence more than you wanted me. So in that courtroom, I tried for once in my life to want the truth more than I wanted to be your rescuer. It was the only thing I had left to give you that you might believe. I don't know if it was right, but it's why. And Catherine Caldwell stood in her doorway above a chandler's shop, with a manor signed into her own maiden name, and a husband going down the stairs, who had finally 3 weeks and a lifetime too late learned to look and ask and not assume. And she understood that he had given her in that courtroom the one thing she had asked of him in the study and not received. He had asked instead of told. He had looked instead of assumed. He had let the truth speak for itself, rather than speaking for her. It did not undo the moment with the paper. Nothing would. He was right about that, and she had told him so, and she did not take it back. But it was not nothing. It was, she thought, watching him reach the bottom of the stairs, the first wholly honest thing Ethan Caldwell had ever done for her sake, and not his own. "You didn't ask," she said, "to come back." He stopped at the bottom, his hand on the rail. "No," he said, "I didn't. I haven't the right to ask it, and I know I haven't, and I'd not insult you by asking for a thing I've not earned and may never earn. I came to give you your house and my understanding of what I did, and to take nothing. That's all. That's the whole of why I came." "I know," Catherine said. "That's why I'm telling you." She paused, and the thing in her chest that had been hard as a fence post these long weeks shifted again further this time, and she let it. "You came up these stairs to ask for nothing. Do you understand what a strange thing that is for you? 3 years I lived with a man who took my hours, my work, my silence, my faith, and never once knew he was taking because he'd never in his life had to ask for a thing he wanted. And now you stand at the bottom of my stairs, having come all this way to want nothing." Her voice was very quiet. "That's the first honest thing you've ever said to me, Ethan. The nothing. The not asking. That's worth more than the manor, too." He looked up at her from the foot of the stairs. "I don't know what to do with that," he said honestly. "I came not to hope for anything. I know you did. Don't start now." But there was, for the first time in the whole long ruin of it, the faintest thing at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile, and not quite not one. "Go home, Ethan. Go to the house. It's mine now, but it's got rooms enough, and I'll not have it said I put a man out on foot having had it done to me. Go home tonight. And tomorrow, if you've a mind not to come back. I didn't say come back. But if you've a mind to learn how a body asks for a thing instead of taking it, and how a body listens instead of judging, and how a body earns a door instead of being handed one, then you might come to the river path tomorrow where the bench is, and you might bring no robe and no deed, and no scrap of paper, and you might just stand there, and ask me how my day was, and listen to the answer, and not assume you already know it." He stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at her, and the hat came off his head again, slow of its own accord. "That's not forgiveness," he said. "No," Catherine said. "It isn't. Forgiveness is a long road, and I'm only at the start of it, and I may not reach the end. And you'll have to live with that, not knowing the way you'll live with the moment in the study. It's not forgiveness, Ethan." She put her hand on the latch of her own door, in her own house, that no man could ever put her out of again. "It's the start of something we never had the first time, because the first time you took me, and I let myself be taken, and neither of us ever once had to earn the other. This time you'll earn it. Every day. By asking. By listening. By never once assuming you know what I lost, while you were busy believing others." She let that land the same words she'd thrown at him across the public square the day the crowd turned "Come home now" to roost between them. "And if you can do that, if you can learn it all the way down and not just for a season while your guilt is fresh, then we'll see. That's all I'll give you. We'll see. It's more than you came for. It's less than you'd hoped. And it's the only honest thing I've got to offer a man I no longer trust, but have not, God help me, entirely stopped loving." The chandler's stair was very quiet. Ethan Caldwell stood at the foot of it with his hat in his hands and his wife's true name on a deed in the county clerk's office, and 3 weeks of ruin behind him and a river path before him in the morning, and he did the only thing left to a man who had finally learned the whole bitter weight of the difference between taking and being given. He did not climb the stairs. He did not reach for her. He did not say one word more than he had earned the right to say. He bowed his head once the way a man bows it to a thing larger than himself, and he set his hat back on and he said, "Tomorrow then, the river path. No robe, no deed, no paper. I'll ask, and I'll listen, and I'll not assume." And his voice broke on the last of it just slightly, the way it had broken in the courtroom, and he let it break and did not hide it. "Thank you, Catherine. Not for the chance. For the honesty. I've had a great deal of the other thing in my life, most of it my own, and I find I'd rather have one hard true word from you than a lifetime of easy ones from the whole rest of the county put together. Good night, Ethan." "Good night." And he went out into the summer dark, and Catherine Caldwell shut her own door behind him, in her own house on her own terms for the first time in her life, and she stood a long while with her back against the wood and her hand pressed flat over the place in her chest where the fence post had been, and felt it against all her will and all her wisdom and all the hard sense the world had beaten into her. Begin very slowly, the smallest fraction to thaw. She had not promised Mrs. Doyle she would let him fall. The old woman had noticed she did not promise, and now standing in the dark with the thaw beginning. Catherine understood at last why she hadn't been able to give that promise, and the understanding frightened her more than the trial had, more than the boardwalk, more than anything in the whole long ruin. She had not stopped loving him. She had only stopped trusting him, and those she was beginning to learn were two entirely different roads, and a body could be all the way to the end of the one and only just setting out on the other, and have no earthly idea standing in the dark of her own house, how long the second road ran, or where it came out, or whether the man on the stairs below had it in him to walk the whole hard length of it beside her. But he would be at the river path in the morning. She knew that much, and she knew she would be there too, and for tonight, in a house that was finally wholly undeniably her own. That was enough. He was at the river path in the morning, before her with no robe and no deed and no scrap of paper, exactly as she'd said, standing with his hat in his hands, like a man waiting on a verdict he knew he had no right to expect to go his way. Catherine came down the path and stopped a little distance off, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the river went on, the way it always had, asking nothing of either of them. "Well," she said, "ask then." And Ethan Caldwell, who had spent his whole life telling people things, opened his mouth to ask his wife how her day had been, and found he did not know how. The man had charged killers and sentenced forgers, and never once fumbled a word from the bench, and he stood on a river path and could not find the way to ask a simple question, because asking real, asking the kind that doesn't already know the answer, was a muscle he had never in 40 years been made to use. "How was your—" He started and stopped and shook his head at himself, disgusted. "No, that's not I'm doing it wrong already. I'm saying the words like a man reading them off a card." "You are?" Catherine agreed. She did not help him. She had decided on the walk down that she would not help him, that the whole point was that he learned to do it without help. And so she stood and let him flounder, and watched to see what he'd do with the floundering. What he did was the thing that decided her in the end, though it would take months yet for the deciding to finish. He laughed, short and rueful, and at his own expense, and there was no bitterness in it, and no charm in it either, none of Mercer's practiced ease, none of the magistrate's armor, just a man caught out being bad at a thing, and not minding that she'd seen. "I don't know how to do this," he said plainly. "That's the truth of it. I've never asked anyone anything in my life that I didn't already think I knew the answer to. I asked you to marry me knowing you'd say yes. I asked the county for the bench knowing they'd give it. I have never once stood in front of a person and not known and wanted to know anyway, and waited." He turned his hat in his hands. "So I'm going to be bad at it, Catherine, for a long while. I'm going to fumble it and say the wrong thing and reach for the easy word out of habit. And I'm asking you there, that's an ask market. I'm asking you to bear the badness of it, while I learn the way you bore everything else. Except this time, I'll know I'm asking you to bear something. That's the only difference I can promise you at the start. That I'll know." Catherine looked at him a long moment. "That's a better start than the words off the card," she said. "Sit down, not close. There." She pointed to the far end of the bench and took the near end herself, and a careful arm's length of summer air sat between them like a third party to the negotiation. "Now, ask me how my day was, and this time don't read it. Mean it." And he did. He turned on the bench and he looked at her. Looked the way he'd failed to look across a study, and finally learned to look across a courtroom, and he asked her how her day had been, and he waited, and when she answered, he did not nod along, thinking of the next thing he'd say. He listened. She watched him listen. It was a small thing, and it was the largest thing in the world, and they both knew it, and the river went on. That was the first morning. There were a great many mornings. She did not let him back into the house, her house, for a long time, and he did not ask to come, which was the only reason she eventually let him. He took a room in town at the Chandlers', in fact 2 floors below the one she'd rented in her ruin, and the irony of it was not lost on the county, which watched the whole strange, slow courtship in reverse with an interest that never quite tipped into mockery, because there was something in it that even a hard people recognized as too honest to laugh at. He came to the river path. He asked. He listened. Some mornings she sent him away after 10 minutes because he'd reached for an assumption, and she'd caught him at it, and he went without argument, because he'd agreed at the start that she would be the judge of his learning, and he would not appeal her rulings. Some mornings he caught his own assumption before she did, and stopped and corrected himself, and on those mornings something between them moved a half-inch forward that no deed or verdict could have moved, and the county changed around them while they did it, and that was its own slow miracle. For Catherine did not spend those months only on a bench by a river. She had a manor now, and land, and her own name on the deed, and a thing she had learned in a rented room that she could not unlearn, that the law in a hostile mouth could ruin an innocent woman, and that there had been no lawyer in 4 counties willing to stand up for one. She thought about that a great deal. She thought about the 3rd lawyer, especially, the honest frightened one, with 3 children, who had shut the door gently, and said he was sorry, and meant it. He had not been a bad man. He had only been a man with everything to lose, and nothing to gain, by standing up, and she understood, having been the one no one would stand up for, exactly how a county came to have no one in it willing to stand. So she built the thing that the county would speak of long after it had forgotten the trial. She took a piece of the manor land down by the county seat, and she put up a house on it, plain and solid, and she called it what it was, a place where a body who could not pay could come and be heard. She hired the honest frightened lawyer first, the one with 3 children, and paid him out of the manor's holdings, so that he had everything to gain by standing up, and nothing to lose by it, and she made it his whole work to be the man who would stand when no one else would. And when folks asked her why, when the gallery that had once called her shameless asked the woman, they'd wronged, why she of all people would spend her own restored fortune defending the friendless, she gave them the only answer she had. "Because I stood in a courtroom with no one," Catherine said, "and I won by a miracle in a scrap of paper, and most who stand there with no one don't have either. I had a husband on the bench who finally learned to look. The next woman won't, so I'll be the looking. That's all. That's the whole of it." The county did not quite know what to do with that. The same way it hadn't known what to do with Ethan stripping himself bare 3 mornings running. It had wronged her, and it had expected when the truth came out to be made to pay for the wronging, to be scolded, shamed, held to account. And instead, the woman it had wronged took its money's worth of guilt and built a thing that would outlive every soul who'd crossed the street from her. There is no answer. A guilty crowd fears more than being forgiven by being made better. It would have been easier on all of them if she'd hated them. She knew it. She did it anyway. Ethan helped her build it. Not as the magistrate he was careful about, that careful never to let his office be the thing that made the place work, because they had both had their fill of what a man's office could do. He helped as a man who knew the law and wanted for once to use the knowing of it to keep a door open instead of signing one shut. They worked side by side over the plans and the hiring and the first hard cases, the arm's length of summer air between them shrinking by inches over the seasons, and somewhere in the work, not in a grand moment, not in a confession on a stair, but in the plain daily labor of building a thing together that was larger than either of them. The trust began very slowly to come back, It did not come back the way it had been. That was the thing Catherine had told him on the stair, and it proved true to the letter. They did not get back the marriage they'd had, the one where he took, and she let herself be taken, and neither ever had to earn the other. That marriage was dead. Mercer had killed it, and Ethan had helped, and no amount of river mornings would resurrect it, and neither of them wanted it resurrected in the end, because they had both seen finally how rotten its foundations had always been, beneath the love that grew on top. What came instead was something they built new board by board, the way they built the house by the county seat. A thing that had to be earned every day, because it had been broken once, and they both remembered the breaking. A thing with no assumptions left in it anywhere, because the assumptions had all been burned out in the fire, and what was left was only what two people choose each morning on purpose, with their eyes open. It was a full year before she let him come to supper at the manor. 2 before she took his arm in the street without thinking about it first. And it was nearly 3 years to the season from the night he'd put the papers on the table before he stood with her again in front of a preacher quietly. This time, with no county packed in to watch only Mrs. Doyle and Ada and the honest lawyer and a handful of folk who'd earned the right to be there and married her a second time. Catherine Hale, the deed still said, and she kept it that way, and he never once asked her to change it because he understood by then exactly why a woman might want one thing in her life that no man knew the size of, and exactly why she'd want her own name standing on the ground beneath her feet. At that second wedding, old Mrs. Doyle stood at the front instead of the back, and when it was done, she took Catherine's hands the way she had in a rented room over a candle, and her level chin trembled the way it had that night, and she said the only thing she'd held back all those years. "You never promised me," the old woman said, "that night, when I told you to let him fall if he failed you twice. You wouldn't promise. I carried that home 4 miles in the dark, and I never could decide was it the best thing in you or the most dangerous." She searched Catherine's face. "Which was it in the end? You'd know now if anyone does." "It was both," Catherine said. "It's always both, Mrs. Doyle. The thing that wouldn't let me promise to let him fall was the same thing that let Mercer use me in the first place, that I love past my own good sense, and always have and likely always will." She pressed the old hands. "The difference is the first time I let it make me blind. This time I made it wait and watch and judge and not give 1 inch it hadn't earned. Love didn't save Ethan. Love's what nearly ruined us both. What saved us was that I stopped letting love do my looking for me." She smiled fully now, the first full smile the old woman had seen on her in 3 years. "He had to learn to look instead of assume. I had to learn to love without going blind. We were both half a person when this started. We're closer to whole now. That's not the same as happy, but it's better than happy. It's true. And that was the marriage they made, and it was a good one, and it lasted, and it was nothing at all like the one they'd had before, and that was precisely why it held. The river path stayed theirs. Long after they'd no need of it, long after the arm's length of air had closed, and the trust had grown back stronger in the broken places. The way a bone does. They walked it most mornings. And most mornings. He still asked her how she'd slept, how her day looked, what she carried, and he still waited for the answer, still listened to the whole of it, still caught himself on the rare morning he started to assume and stopped and turned it into a question instead. He never stopped having to choose it. That was the point. He had taken her once without having to choose. He chose her now every single day on purpose, with his eyes open, and the choosing was worth more than all the easy years before it put together. Mercer, for his part, served his sentence and was led out an old man into a country that had forgotten him, and he tried once near the end to send Catherine a letter. She knew the hand the moment it came, the crossing of the T, the impatient tail on the Y, the hand that had practiced her ruin smooth in her own husband's chair. She did not open it. She did not burn it in anger or keep it in triumph. She simply handed it unopened to the honest lawyer at the house by the county seat and said, "Put it in the records. Someday a body will study how a thing like this is done, and they'll want to see the hand that did it." And that was the last weight Julian Mercer ever had in her life. Not an enemy, not a ghost, just an exhibit filed and labeled in a place built to make sure his kind never won so easy again. He had told her twice that it was never about her, that she was only the door. He had been right, and he had never understood why being right damned him. Because a man who treats a person as a door, as a thing to be taken off its hinges and gotten past, will always in the end be undone by the simple fact he refused to credit that there is a person there. That the door has a woman behind it. That she sees and remembers and waits, and that one day, in her own time by her own hand, or by the hand she's patiently taught to do it, she walks the truth home, down the long, slow road to the very door she left from. Catherine Hale had walked it home. She had lost her name and won it back larger. She had been put out on foot with one bag and ended with the whole manor in her own name and a house by the county seat that would outlast her by 100 years. She had been a woman no lawyer would stand for, and she had become the thing that stood. She had loved a man who failed her, and she had not let the failing make her hard, and she had not let the love make her blind, and she had made him earn board by board, and morning by morning, a marriage truer than the one his earlier certainty had nearly killed them both inside of. And on the morning she was an old woman herself, walking the river path on the arm of the man who had finally fully all the way down, and not just for a season, learned to look and ask and never assume. On that morning she stopped the way she'd stopped the first day, to make him mean the question, and she looked at the water that had gone on the whole time, asking nothing of either of them. And she said the thing that was the truest thing she knew, the thing the whole long ruin and the whole long rebuilding had taught her past all forgetting. "They thought my silence was weakness," Catherine said. "Every one of them. You that first night waiting for me to break. Mercer reckoning a quiet woman was a door he could lift off its hinges. The whole county on that boardwalk certain a woman who didn't weep was a woman who was guilty." She watched the river. "But a quiet woman isn't a weak one. She's a patient one. She's a woman keeping her own counsel while she waits for the slow horse to come home. And it always comes home, Ethan. That's the one thing I'd carve on my own stone if they'd let me. The truth is a slow horse, and the world is full of clever men who whip it and bury it and sell it and swear it dead, and it comes home anyway, every time in its own season to the very door it left from. They only mistook how long I was willing to wait at that door." Ethan covered her hand on his arm with his own, and he did not say a word, because he had learned at last that some things you do not answer, you only witness. And Catherine Hale looked at the river one moment more, and then she turned and walked on an old woman on the arm of the man she had taught to be worthy of her past. The house she had built for the friendless, and the manor that stood in her own name, and the whole length of a county that had learned the hard way exactly what it had nearly thrown away. She had signed the papers without a tear, and the silence that followed had not been her breaking. It had been the sound of a woman at last beginning to win,